After repeatedly asking the US for a few of their MGM-140 Army tactical missile systems, ATACMS for short, Ukrainian forces will finally be getting this long-awaited upgrade to their arsenal. In September, military officials in Washington confirmed they will be sending as many ATACMS over the coming weeks as the US could reasonably spare. And as of mid-October, these high-tech surface-to-surface artillery weapons have been making an impact. But how? In what way? Why are these missiles so crucial for Ukraine compared to other weapons? Let's find out. While offering a special thanks to his friends at the White House recently, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky added that the missiles have more than proven themselves during a pair of synchronized nighttime attacks. Zelensky said that the ATACMS were used against two military airfields, one in Berdyansk and the other in the Luhansk region, a dual strike that resulted in significant losses on the Russian side, including 9 military helicopters, an anti-aircraft missile battery, and an ammunition storage depot. Bolstered by their recent upgrade from Washington, Ukrainian officials have stated plainly that with these new weapons at hand, there will be nowhere left for Russian troops to hide within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. This pair of attacks was executed shortly after Russia launched a surprise attack on the town of Avdiivka in eastern Ukraine. Encompassing 3 battalions comprised of some 2,000 troops, along with dozens of armored vehicles and a handful of jets providing air support, this would turn out to be the largest assault carried out in this area so far. But this was only the latest flare-up of the ongoing contest for the much-contested municipality of Avdiivka, considered by both sides to be the gateway to the city of Donetsk, the capital of Ukraine's eastern Donbas region. Avdiivka not only has significant strategic importance, but the town has been the stage for many frontline battles since Moscow annexed Crimea 9 years ago, essentially triggering the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Since then, the town has been heavily fortified, making it extremely difficult for Russian troops to establish a foothold there. This has also turned the town, which had a pre-war population of nearly 32,000, but is now down to around 1,600 residents, mostly living in basements and other sub-ground dwellings, into a symbol of the Ukrainian people's unflinching resistance. Ukrainian defensive positions in Avdiivka have allowed its forces to resist repeated Russian attacks, at least for now. At this point, losing this territory would be a tough blow for Ukraine, both strategically and in terms of morale, especially after this summer's highly anticipated counteroffensive resulted in only marginal gains. So why is Biden giving ATACMS to Ukraine such a big deal? Well, for one, Ukrainian forces have so far been able to fend off dozens of attacks, so it will certainly be interesting to see how the arrival of ATACMS missiles on the battlefield shifts the advantage. And for two, the ATACMS will undoubtedly play a crucial role on the battlefield, as Kyiv continues to ramp up its assaults on Russian-occupied areas of Crimea. Recently, Ukrainian forces have expanded their attempts to undermine Russian forces, including the launch of a devastating attack on a Russian naval base in Sevastopol back in September that damaged a ship and a submarine and injured 24 people. And more recently, there was the destruction of the 2 Russian landing crafts by Ukrainian sea drones, an overnight operation that was part of a series of escalating strikes on the peninsula. Ukraine insists that the strikes on Crimea, which have mostly targeted Russian naval bases and vessels, are a critical element of their overall counteroffensive strategy. Ultimately, they want to make it impossible for Russia to continue its assault on the Ukrainian mainland, and in the process, Kyiv is hoping to land a few strategic and symbolic blows against Russian forces, which the ATACMS should certainly help with, as focus shifts back toward Crimea. The escalation of attacks across Crimea began after Russia allowed the Black Sea Grain Initiative to lapse this past July, a globally crucial deal that has allowed Ukraine to export grain by sea. Previously, foreign container ships were allowed to bypass Russia's blockade and navigate safely to Turkey's Bosphorus Strait, then onto global markets. Ukraine's uninterrupted export of grain is vital for stabilizing global food prices and bringing relief to many developing countries. The impact this war, and certainly the collapse of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, has had on global food markets has been disastrous, especially given that Ukraine is a major supplier of food to the World Food Programme, WFP, an international organization within the UN that provides food assistance across the globe. At a glance, Ukraine's contribution makes up 10% of the global wheat market, 15% of the corn market, and 13% of the barley market. It's also a key player in the world's sunflower oil market. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization (FAO), another organization within the UN, as many as 47 million people could face serious problems in terms of food insecurity as a result of this war. And now, with Russia's Black Sea Fleet resuming its blockade of Ukraine's ports, vital grain exports are being prevented, creating a direct threat to global food security, what Zelensky has simply called another attempt by Russia to weaponize hunger and destabilize the global food market. This situation has left Ukraine eager to secure its position in Crimea, which has meant, along with their missiles and drone strikes, a stepping up of their clandestine operations as well. Recently, in the occupied city of Luhansk, a car explosion killed pro-Moscow former head of police, Mikhail Filipenko. Representatives of Ukraine's defense intelligence have claimed responsibility for the apparent assassination, saying it was a joint operation carried out with pro-Ukrainian partisans, before issuing a warning of retribution to other pro-Russian officials positioned in occupied areas. There was also, quite recently, the bombing of a Russian train outside the city of Ryazan, about 196 kilometers (122 miles) southeast of Moscow. Placed on a section of track, the improvised explosive device derailed 19 freight cars and caused several injuries. And though Kyiv hasn't officially taken responsibility, that hasn't stopped the Kremlin from making the accusation, citing a series of recent cross-border strikes by Ukrainian forces and their allies. The question seems to be now, other than the success they've already had, how will Kyiv make the most of their new weapon? Ukrainian forces were already familiar with the wheeled M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system, a mobile rocket launcher commonly known as the HIMARS, that are used to carry and fire ATACMS. Up until now, though, the US had only been supplying shorter-range guided rockets, fired from a HIMARS mobile launcher or a tracked M270 multiple launch rocket system, or MLRS. The longest-range variants of the ATACMS can strike targets out to a distance of 300 kilometers (190 miles). This extension of their reach will more than likely allow Ukrainian forces to launch attacks further into Russian-held territories, including the Crimean Peninsula and other areas bordering the Black Sea. So you might be wondering, besides its impressive range, what's the big deal with ATACMS? Well, to start, most of these 4-meter-long missiles carry a WDU-18 230 kg, 500 pound blast fragmentation warhead. They can travel in excess of Mach 3, around 3,700 kilometers, 2,300 miles per hour, and, depending on which variant you choose, they can cost between $820,000 and $1.7 million apiece. The impressive speed of the ATACMS compared to similar cruise missiles, such as the UK's Storm Shadow or Russia's KH-101, has been one of its key selling points, and is due largely to the fact that the ATACMS is, essentially, a ballistic missile with a rocket engine strapped to its back, which makes them very hard to shoot out of the sky. Okay, so if these high-tech precision missiles come with a rocket engine on the back, what comes at the front? When it comes to the payload carried on the ATACMS, you've really got two options. One is a unitary warhead, which is basically what it sounds like, a single explosive charge. The other is a submunition warhead, a container filled with lots of submunitions or bomblets. These are also mostly what they sound like, a bunch of little bombs that can be dispersed over a large target area. In terms of ATACMS, this means hundreds of steel-cased balls filled with incendiary pellets. So which one is better? Well, it largely depends on your intended target. Unitary warheads are better for destroying specific targets, say a stationary tank, ammunition depot, or a large artillery piece, while submunition warheads will be more effective against moving targets, say a convoy of vehicles or an advancing column of troops. Both warhead variations have been designed with specific target categories in mind, but both can be highly effective against a wide variety of individual targets too. The ATACMS platform also comes with a number of variants, though it's not 100% clear which one President Biden ended up passing on to the Ukrainians. The most widely produced variant is the M39 Block 1, which was added to the US's arsenal in 1991. The original design for this variant had a range of 25 to 165 kilometers, 15 to 100 miles, and carried a payload of 950 incendiary bomblets, each about the size of a baseball and weighing around 0.6 kilograms. And when dispersed above a target, these bomblets can cover an area of 33,000 square meters, 360,000 square feet. Although no longer in production, about 1,650 of the M39 Block 1 variants were made, with several hundred of those being used in combat during both Operation Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom. All remaining missiles have been modified to carry a unitary fragmentation warhead. But this hasn't been the only variant to be used in combat over the years. With nearly double the range and a GPS-aided guidance system, the M39A1 variant can reach targets anywhere from 12 to 185 miles, 20 to 300 kilometers away, but carries a somewhat smaller payload of just 300 incendiary bomblets. Entering the US's arsenal in 1997, some 610 of these were produced, with around 74 being used in combat, primarily during Operation Iraqi Freedom. This variation is no longer in production, and all remaining units have also had their cluster munition payloads swapped out for a single warhead. Arriving in 2001, the M48 variant, a quick-reaction unitary missile with a GPS-aided guidance system, carries a single 230kg, 500-pound, high-explosive warhead and has a maximum range of 185 miles, 300 kilometers. It should be noted that when a fragmentation warhead, like the one found on this variant and many others, explodes, the blast sends thousands of metallic fragments flying in every direction, much like a 360-degree spray of bullets. Between 2001 and 2004, 176 M48s were produced, 16 of which were used during Operation Iraqi Freedom, while another 42 appeared in combat during Operation Enduring Freedom. The remaining missiles are in the possession of the US Army and Marine Corps. Then there's the M57 variant, which is similar in many ways to the M48, mainly in its ability to carry a single high-explosive warhead out to a distance of some 185 miles or 300 kilometers. Going into production directly after the M48 went out, a little over 500 of these were made, but only 33 have been used in combat, reportedly during Operation Enduring Freedom. The M57 is also very accurate, boasting a circular error probability, CEP, of less than 9 meters, or 30 feet. Typically expressed as a radius, CEP is an important measurement for assessing the accuracy of guided munitions, such as missiles. CEP and missile accuracy in general can be influenced by a range of factors, including guidance system technology and environmental conditions. So essentially, the smaller the CEP, the more accurate the system is considered to be. Let's say, for example, a missile has a CEP of 20 meters. This means there's a high probability, usually greater than 50%, that the actual point of impact will be within a 20 meters radius of the intended target, which means that an M57 ATACMS missile, fired from, let's say, Brussels, Belgium or Dunkirk, could reliably hit the Eiffel Tower, as well as a range of smaller targets located at the same distances. Which brings us to the last variant we're going to look at, but certainly not the least, the M57A1, which is basically identical to the M57 in terms of general specifications and capabilities, except for one major difference. The warhead found on this variant comes with an adjustable blast height, allowing for a wider dispersion of bomb fragments should the situation call for it. After looking more closely at the ATACMS, we can definitely conclude that it has superior speed, range, versatility, accuracy, and explosive power than any other surface-to-surface missile on the market. Its most notable feature, however, might just be the mobility of the system from which it's launched. Because the ATACMS can be launched from a mobile ground vehicle like the HIMARS, which they're already familiar with, Ukrainian troops can easily shoot and then move over a variety of different terrains. Ukrainian combatants can hide if necessary. They can avoid retaliatory attacks. And most importantly, they can create a sense of uncertainty for the Russians, who won't be able to predict where the next strike might be coming from. In practical terms, this means that a Ukrainian mobile artillery unit traveling in an ATACMS-equipped HIMARS could stop basically anywhere, anytime, and launch a precision attack on a target it would take them perhaps 5 to 6 hours to drive to, if they could reach it by land at all. Clearly, Washington's gift of the ATACMS has opened up a range of strategic options for Ukraine's perpetually outnumbered forces, options that could lead to plenty of scenarios where Ukraine has a significant battlefield advantage. The arrival of the ATACMS could very well allow for easier destruction of Russia's air defense systems, airfields, and other military installations deep within the enemy's territory, as we've already seen Ukraine do when they recently used their new missiles to wipe out a pair of Russian air bases. In the wake of this recent news, many of Ukraine's supporters have been quick to applaud Biden's generosity, But it's also important not to get carried away here. Old Uncle Joe didn't just happily hand over a bunch of his precious ATACMs the first time Zelensky asked for them. The folks in Washington have actually been quite hesitant to do so, and for two pretty good reasons. One, there's the risk that significantly increasing Kyiv's fighting ability might also increase the tension between the US and Russia. And two, the US also had its own national security needs to consider, as its stockpile of ATACMs, which have been out of production since 2017, has continued to dwindle. The latter issue, however, keeping enough ATACMs on hand to balance its own security needs with those of Ukraine and Europe as a whole, seems to have been mostly resolved by the recent arrival of a suitable replacement. And it is fancy. In March 2016, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon Technologies announced they'd be working in tandem to develop a missile that would meet the US Army's replacement requirements. This new missile, if it would indeed end up shouldering out the ATACMs, would need not only advanced propulsion, allowing it to fly faster and farther, it would also need to be thinner and sleeker. For what purpose, you ask? So that the loadout could be increased to 2 per pod, doubling the number of missiles that could be carried by the HIMARS or tracked by the M270 MLRS. Well, the Army ultimately got what they wanted, introducing the Precision Strike Missile, or PrSM for short, which has reportedly left production and will be entering US stockpiles in the near future, if it hasn't already. The PrSM, which would ultimately be developed by Lockheed Martin, is at the leading edge of long-range precision strike missiles. With an equally cool-sounding name compared to the ATACMs, this next-generation surface-to-surface weapon uses enhanced attack capabilities to neutralize, suppress, and destroy targets at a distance of 310+ miles, over 499 kilometers. On top of increased range, lethality, in-flight survivability, and missile loadout, the PrSM also comes with an advanced cluster munition warhead comprised of preformed fragments. While the PrSM development program started out as a competitive effort between Lockheed and Raytheon, Raytheon would end up withdrawing from the competition in early 2020 due to technical issues that delayed their missile's flight test. The original intent of both companies was to reach a maximum range of no more than 499 kilometers, due to restrictions outlined in the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed by former President Ronald Reagan and former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. Among other restrictions, the INF Treaty prevents signatories from developing missiles that can travel 500 kilometers or more, but these limitations went out the window in August 2019, when former President Donald Trump decided to withdraw from the treaty. This decision came after more than a decade of accusations, coming from both the US and Russia, that the other had violated the terms of the treaty. And so, with a brand new long-range precision missile in their arsenal, and who knows what variants on the way, the only thing that will stop Washington from providing ATACMs to Ukraine was Russian President Vladimir Putin's uncertain reaction. In short, he wasn't pleased. So far, Putin has said that the US providing Kyiv with ATACMs was a big mistake, and that the US is wading deeper and deeper into a conflict the Russian leader believes is none of its business. Previously, Putin called the delivery of ATACMs to Ukraine a red line that the US had better not cross. Yet he's also stated that the ATACMs will not make a significant difference on the battlefield, that Russian forces will have no trouble repelling attacks, and this intrusion by the US will only serve to prolong this war and bring more suffering to the people of Ukraine. But this isn't the first time Putin has brought up the subject of long-range missiles. When Russia initially marched more than 100,000 troops to the border of Ukraine, 2 months before they invaded, the Kremlin also sent NATO a list of demands that was structured as more of a one-sided treaty, along with the articles insisting that NATO both shuts its doors to new members and remove all its forces from the 14 countries that joined after the Soviet Union collapsed. One article declares that no land-based missiles be deployed to areas that would allow them to reach any territory belonging to Russia. Technically, the missiles haven't gotten closer, their range has just increased, but still, this was the red line Putin was referring to. But now that it's been crossed, the Russian president doesn't seem overly concerned. This could be because he was expecting it, or because the delivery of the ATACMs, however significant their future impact could be, is only a small part of a much larger delivery from the US, a delivery that's come to exceed $76 billion in humanitarian, financial, and military support, which has been offered to Ukraine by the Biden administration and the US Congress since the war began. While dozens of other countries have also provided large aid packages to Ukraine, including most members of NATO and the European Union, the US has really taken the lead. So far, the US has delivered surveillance and attack drones, coastal defense ships, satellite communications equipment, and advanced surveillance and radar systems. They've sent over hundreds of Abrams tanks and artillery pieces, thousands of Humvees and other tactical vehicles, tens of thousands of rockets, missiles, and various other munitions, not to mention several types of anti-aircraft missiles, including 12 National Advanced Surface-to-Air Missile Systems (NASAMS), and 1 Patriot Air Defense Battery plus munitions. And on top of 35,000 grenade launchers and small arms with ammunition, other extremely helpful but less publicized items the US has sent to Ukraine include night vision and thermal imagery systems, laser rangefinders, C4 explosives, explosive ordnance disposal equipment, M18A1 Claymore mines, cold weather gear, and generators. Breaking down the numbers, around $3.9 billion, or 5% of the total, has gone to humanitarian aid, in the form of emergency food assistance, healthcare, and refugee support, among other resources, while another $26.4 billion, or 34%, has gone to financial and budgetary aid via loans and the Economic Support Fund, an economic assistance fund used to advance the US's political and strategic interests by helping allied countries meet their political, economic, and security needs. And the rest of that $75+ billion, that's all gone directly or indirectly to weapons, ammunition, and military equipment. Nearly a quarter of the total, around $18.3 billion, has been allocated for security assistance in the form of training, equipment, weapons, and logistic support provided via the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, a program initiated by the US Department of Defense with the intention of providing help to Ukraine by enhancing its defense capabilities and mitigating certain security challenges, mainly a Russian invasion. Another $23.5 billion worth of weapons and military equipment has come directly from the DoD's personal supply. And still another $4.7 billion has come in the form of grants and loans for weapons and equipment via the Foreign Military Financing Program, another US initiative, this one providing grants and loans to nations so they can purchase weapons, defense equipment and services, and military training from the US through government-to-government sales. Long before crossing Putin's metaphorical red line with his delivery of ATACMS, Biden also stirred up the hornet's nest, as well as some international controversy, when he agreed to furnish Ukraine with cluster munitions, which most countries have banned due to the increased risk their use poses to civilians by 1. Their lack of precision, and 2. The danger of undetonated ordnance being triggered accidentally later on. Still, a number of analysts in the West have asserted that the assistance offered by the US, as well as its allies, has been crucial in Ukraine's continued defense, and has even created the opportunity to launch a number of critical counteroffensives against Russia. Some analysts, as well as many supporters of Ukraine, also believe the country's failure to expel Russia will result in the subjugation of millions of Ukrainians, while simultaneously fueling Putin's ambitions to recover territory that once belonged to the former Soviet Union, which might also end up encouraging China to pursue or enhance similar aggressive tactics, which means military support for Ukraine will likely continue. To a significant degree, though it has certainly not been alone, the US has led the world in offering security assistance to Ukraine. Their javelins have halted Russian tanks during their savage assault on Kyiv. Their air defense systems have intercepted Russian strikes aimed at Ukrainian infrastructure. The US has also provided financial and humanitarian assistance, which has helped Ukraine maintain highly fundamental services such as healthcare and heat. Many NATO members, including the US and other allied nations, have, too, been cautious about getting directly involved in the conflict, being concerned primarily with Putin's not-so-subtle threats of starting a nuclear war. As we've seen, however, governments across the world have overcome their initial hesitancy and provided Ukraine with increasingly sophisticated assets, including battle tanks, modern fighter aircraft, and now, high-tech, long-range precision missile systems. But what do you think? Has the US crossed a line by sending ATACMS to Ukraine? Should NATO and its allies simply stay out of it? Are we inching closer to a global nuclear conflict instigated by Russia? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. At this point, we're pretty sure that Putin is sticking his head into a paper bag in panic and trying not to hyperventilate on a daily basis. While he has several reasons for doing this, losing thousands of tanks on the battlefield in Ukraine, the ongoing NATO expansion, coup attempts, and more, there's another looming threat that he can't seem to escape. Ukraine is equipped with US weapons, and Russia can't seem to stop them. But why? Is Putin really that incompetent? What are these weapons, and how come Putin can't fight them off? Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine began more than a year ago, the United States has committed more than $45 billion worth of aid to help the country defend its sovereignty. Much of this has taken the form of high-tech, lethal military equipment. The assistance has proven to be critical for Ukraine's battlefield success and a nightmare for Putin and his top military planners. Now, 19 months into the conflict, it could make all the difference in Ukraine's slowly growing counteroffensive. So let's take a look at what equipment the US has sent so far. What else might it be planning to send, and why Russian troops seem to be so helpless against US-exported firepower. Among the most important weapons the US has sent so far to Ukraine is the FGM-148 Javelin, a potent anti-tank guided missile system or ATGM. Jointly manufactured by defense giants Raytheon and Lockheed Martin, the Javelin first entered service in 1996 as a replacement for the older M47 Dragon missile. It has also proven to be one of the most effective pieces of US military aid. Ukraine has received more than 7,000 Javelins since the start of the invasion and has put them to remarkable use. Each Javelin system consists of two parts: the launch tube assembly and the reusable command launch unit, or CLU. The CLU works as the brains of the Javelin and features 4 times magnification as well as night vision and thermal sights. This allows for independent target verification, meaning small, independent squads can use Javelins effectively. Before firing, a 12 times magnification setting allows users to zoom in on a target for identification. To fire, the gunner switches to a Seeker FOV mode with 9 times magnification, which is fed into the missile's guidance unit to lock onto a target. One of the Javelin's biggest strengths is its trajectory. It features 2 modes, direct fire and top attack. In top attack mode, its missiles travel in a high arc, in order to strike the less armored section of a tank at the top of its turret. Its automatic infrared guidance and fire and forget design also allows the user to seek cover immediately after launch and avoid retaliatory strikes. Javelins can also penetrate even the toughest tank armor, as they are fitted with powerful 19-pound tandem warheads. A primary charge penetrates the thick composite armor, while a secondary charge follows and detonates inside the tank. However, these features also make Javelins expensive, at about $200,000 per unit and $78,000 per replacement missile. Money aside, Javelins have become a staple of Ukraine's defense throughout the war so far, even being turned into an inspirational internet meme termed Saint Javelin by Ukrainian-Canadian journalist Christian Boris. Even as the invasion shifted into its current brutal back and forth of artillery barrages trench warfare, the Javelin has continued to prove invaluable to Ukrainian forces. Countless videos like this one shared by Yahoo News have shown unsuspecting Russian troops and tank columns rolling into ambushes by Javelin-wielding Ukrainians. As the Javelins are fired, tanks and other armored vehicles can be seen exploding and catching fire. One tank was able to fire before it was struck and immobilized, billowing smoke. At one point in the video, 3 desperate Russian soldiers can be seen jumping out of a burning vehicle and running away from it. Scenes like this show why the Javelin is among the most effective tools the US has given Ukraine to beat back Russia. But their usefulness has a lot to do with the issues in Russian combat doctrine. Russian tank tactics, which have not evolved much since the 1990s, involve operating tank columns on their own, without the aid of close infantry support. Usually in modern combined arms warfare, infantry units support tanks by keeping hunter-killer teams away, while putting down covering fire and stopping columns from rolling into ambushes. But because Russia operates its armor independently, Ukrainian troops have been able to use Javelins and other ATGMs to wreak havoc on unsuspecting tanks. The next crucial US weapon which has been utilized in Ukraine are several varieties of kamikaze drones. These have become a serious thorn in Putin's side, giving him a small taste of his own medicine. First is the Switchblade. The drone's name comes from the way the spring-loaded wings are folded up inside a tube and flipped out once released. Designed and manufactured by California defense company AbramsX Aerospace, Switchblade drones are light and small enough to fit in a backpack. Launched from a portable 2-foot tube, each drone flies to the target area and can loiter, waiting for its target for up to an hour. Once a target approaches, an operator instructs the drone to dive toward enemy personnel and detonate a small grenade-like charge, releasing a shotgun spray of shrapnel in a specific direction. Its loitering nature means that unlike most other weapons, the Switchblade can wave off or abort a mission if the situation changes after launch, allowing it to engage a secondary target or destroy itself without inflicting casualties or damage to property. Its small size and extended operation time also make it great for destroying entrenched infantry, or even lightly armored vehicles like trucks. Videos like this one, shared on Twitter by open-source analyst AbramsX, show Ukrainian operators launching Switchblades from city streets, before retreating to hidden positions to help guide them. While there are no definitive numbers on targets eliminated with Switchblade drones, it seems likely that they have accounted for hundreds of Russian casualties and equipment losses. There are also two varieties of the drone, the 300 and 600 models. The Switchblade 300 was widely used by US troops in Afghanistan against the Taliban, but considered less than ideal for the higher intensity warfare in Ukraine. Most of those given to Ukraine appear to be the 600 model, which is much larger and heavier, but has a longer flight time and larger payload, making it ideal for taking out heavy armor or fortified positions. But US military aid extended beyond the Switchblade as well. The Pentagon has also given Ukrainian forces a number of Phoenix Ghost drones. These were also developed by AbramsX under the US military's Big Safari weapons program, meant to rapidly acquire and deploy weapons to meet unexpected threats without relying on new research and development. The US has supplied over 1,000 of these killer drones so far, which have proven to be similarly lethal in the hands of Ukrainian operators. While even the larger Switchblades are limited to an hour of loitering, the Phoenix Ghost can hover over an area for up to 6 hours at a time, making it a much deadlier surprise weapon. It can also conduct both day and nighttime surveillance thanks to its advanced infrared sensors, but like the Switchblade, once a target has been detected and identified, the drone dives downwards and explodes on impact. The primary downside of the Phoenix Ghost drone appears to be its reduced speed, which appears in videos to be roughly half that of the Switchblade 600. Even so, Alexei Arestovich, advisor to the Ukrainian president's office, told reporters last year that 580 of such units equals about 350 destroyed targets in the close rear, indicating a roughly 60% success rate. It's unclear how much this has changed, but it seems likely that US-supplied loitering munitions continue to play a big role in Ukraine's ability to strike behind Russian lines. The latest US aid package to Ukraine from July 2023, containing over $1.3 billion of equipment, also reportedly contains hundreds of new Switchblades and Phoenix Ghosts. This is especially important since Kyiv acknowledged in May that its forces are losing about 10,000 drones per month during both intelligence gathering and strike activities. Similarly, military experts have said the relatively large losses of troops and slow advance of Ukrainians' recently launched counteroffensive are due primarily to the dense landmines Russian troops have laid in anticipation. That potentially deadly terrain separating defenders from invading forces will therefore make additional drones capable of inflicting precise attacks on distant targets especially useful. But just why is Russia having so much trouble dealing with these US-made drones? The simple answer is that the country hasn't effectively prepared for modern warfare. Despite its pre-invasion claims that its military could take on even the USA, the fact of the matter is that Russian commanders have proven they have no idea how to wage modern, combined arms warfare. By keeping different elements of their forces isolated and working individually, rather than in coordination, everything from Russian armor to supply lines to infantry troops are far more vulnerable than they should be. There's also the small problem that intelligence gathering among different elements of the Russian military is essentially non-existent. Because different Russian officials are constantly out to get each other and competing for power and influence, they have a strong incentive to let each other's forces take most of the losses, to try and preserve their own power. Obviously, this doesn't work very well when you're facing a determined and increasingly well-armed enemy like Ukraine. The astronomical Russian casualties after a year and a half of fighting are proof enough that Western smart munitions like the Switchblade and Phoenix Ghost are more than Putin's commanders can handle. The less obvious answer is that while Russia is especially unprepared, very few militaries today are prepared to effectively counter the threat of loitering aerial munitions. Just about any force on the planet, including the US itself,
would be hard-pressed to defend against repeated strikes by kamikaze drones. There's simply no way to provide infantry troops with effective protection from them, especially as anti-aircraft guns can almost never hit every drone launched. The best way to defend against something like the Switchblade or Phoenix Ghost are electronic countermeasures, such as EMP pulses, which can knock out the signal of overhead drones. Even so, Russia simply does not have the capabilities to stop their strikes, making these some of the most effective weapons supplied to Ukraine so far. Another critical piece of military hardware that Russia has struggled against is the Stinger missile system. At the start of the war, large numbers of Russian aircraft were operating over Ukraine's airspace, leading to predictions that they would soon establish air superiority. But this wasn't on the cards either. And one main reason is the FIM-92 Stinger missile and its counterparts from around the world given to Ukraine. First entering service in 1981, the Stinger is a man-portable air defense system, or MANPADS, developed by defense giant Raytheon. Russia first encountered these deadly platforms all the way back in 1985, during its invasion of Afghanistan. Back then, the US supplied the Afghan Mujahideen fighters with Stingers, which they put to remarkable use for the next few years. The Stinger hasn't changed much since then. It can engage a target from nearly 2.5 miles away, making it perfect for taking out low-flying aircraft and helicopters. The Stinger's missile is 5 feet long and 2.8 inches in diameter. The missile itself weighs 22 pounds, while the missile with its launch tube and integral sight fitted with a gripstock and identification friend or foe (IFF) antenna weighs approximately 34 pounds. The Stinger uses a smart seeker head able to differentiate between an enemy's exhaust plume and engines, helping it home in on even rapidly moving targets. The warhead itself is roughly 2.3 pounds of HTA-3 explosive, a deadly mix of HMX, TNT, and aluminium powder. This does not make the Stinger any less effective, however, since its targeting system allows it to strike the vulnerable engines of enemy aircraft. To fire the missile, a BCU, battery coolant unit, is inserted into the gripstock. This device consists of a supply of high-pressure argon gas, which is injected into the seeker to cryogenically cool it to operating temperature, and a thermal battery which provides power for target acquisition. A single BCU provides power and coolant for roughly 45 seconds, after which another must be inserted if the missile has not been fired. Guidance to the target is initially achieved through proportional navigation, but once in flight, switches to another mode, which is what allows the missile to avoid exhaust plumes. The answer to why the Stingers have been so effective against Russia this time around again has a lot to do with terrible military doctrine and planning. Russia has long struggled to integrate its use of air power with ground campaigns, something which Ukrainians have been exploiting for more than a year. Because Russia conducted its air sorties independently of ground advances, Ukraine was able to shoot down huge numbers of its low-flying vehicles with Stingers and other MANPAD systems. This was also not helped by Russia's basic lack of precision targeting. Most of its aircraft, especially older models, lack the modern targeting pods found on Western jets, meaning they have to dip low to have any hope of precise strikes on enemy positions. This leaves them extremely vulnerable to surface-to-air missiles like the Stinger, especially when they cannot detect where the missiles are coming from. Next, no video about US weapons would be complete without mention of the HIMARS system. This powerful rocket artillery system is one of the crown jewels of US aid to Ukraine, and in recent months, report suggests they have become increasingly decisive in determining the direction of the war. HIMARS stands for High Mobility Artillery Rocket System, a variety of the MLRS rockets, which have been in use since the 1990s. The HIMARS are considered most effective for attacking stationary targets such as infrastructure and troops in a concentrated area, but their extremely long range means that they can be used from far behind the front lines. As Ian Williams, Deputy Director of the Missile Defense Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, has noted, HIMARS is one of the world's most advanced rocket artillery systems. Its range is farther than anything the Ukrainians had, so when that was transferred, they got the ability to strike targets deeper behind the front lines and much more accurately. Other experts largely concur, and many have pointed out that without the use of HIMARS, Ukraine would not have been able to liberate nearly as much territory as it has. HIMARS rockets have been particularly effective in fighting Russia's offensive in Donbass by allowing Ukraine to attack Russian supply and ammunition depots. They were also crucial in forcing Russia to withdraw from Kherson. George Barros, an analyst on the Russia and Ukraine portfolio at the Institute for the Study of War, concluded that was only possible because the Ukrainians had this extended strike capability to degrade those bridges. Without the HIMARS, I don't think the Ukrainians would have liberated Kherson. And while it's certainly powerful, the HIMARS does not have either the range or payload of its cousin, the M270 MLRS. But what it lacks in range and firepower, the HIMARS more than makes up for in maneuverability. Its concept came about at the end of the Cold War, when it became apparent that the US military would be fighting more low-intensity conflicts in multiple environments. This led the Pentagon to move away from clunky, traditional rocket artillery and towards systems with a lighter footprint. It's this speed and maneuverability which has made the HIMARS so important for Ukraine's war effort. Faced with Russia's overwhelming numbers, Ukraine needed a platform able to rapidly deliver a payload and depart before it could be targeted with enemy counter-battery fire or airstrikes. Traditional artillery would most likely have been blown to bits before it could be moved, have let them launch numerous strikes without substantial retaliation. And once a HIMARS is fired, it usually finds its target. Each of its 6 GLMRS rockets has a range of 57 miles and is armed with a high-precision warhead. This means it can fire from well outside the range of traditional artillery and still hit its targets within several meters of accuracy. This has enabled Ukraine to strike at highly entrenched Russian positions, targeting their weakest points. HIMARS rockets can also each be set to independent targets, or used for repeated strikes on the same area of a fortification. Since Ukraine received its HIMARS, it has used them to take out everything from ammunition depots to command and control centers, managing to slow Russian advances to a crawl. Yet despite devoting large amounts of air power to taking out the missiles, Russia has apparently failed to touch 90% of them, instead losing more and more aircraft to Stingers every time it's tried. Part of the reason for this is that in addition to utilizing the HIMARS mobility, Ukraine also created multiple dummies, consisting of a generic heavy-duty truck frame, painted green and made to look as though it's carrying missiles. Ukraine has also apparently gotten so good at using HIMARS that it has actually been able to take out stalled tank columns, despite the system's intended use against stationary targets. As of last month, the US has supplied 38 HIMARS to Ukraine, but soon it may need more. Former Ukrainian Marine and captured British fighter Aidan Aslin recently told Newsweek that Russia appears to be hoarding its battlefield resources further away, out of HIMARS range. This suggests that the country will soon need more weapons with even greater reach, such as ATACMS or British Storm Shadow missiles. But experts also say the real advantage of sending different long-range missiles lies not in their individual capabilities, but in the numbers. The more missiles Kyiv can get its hands on, the more chances they have to strike Russian targets and the more damage they can do. All of this suggests that while the war shows no signs of stopping soon, Russia remains unable to deal with the superior firepower the US has provided Ukraine. It's not likely to get any better anytime soon either, as Russia continues to run out of resources and trained personnel. But what do you think? Will more US weapons ultimately be what ends the war? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Imagine a non-guided aerial weapon, meticulously designed to unleash its power upon release from an aircraft. The Mk-20, also called the CBU-100 cluster bomb, boasts a robust body crafted from top-notch aluminium, clocking in at just under 500 pounds. But what sets this weapon apart is what happens next. Once airborne, the container housing 247 heat submunitions known as Mk-118 dramatically opens, causing them to rain down on a designated target zone with devastating force. Putin, are you scared yet? Well, you should be. Ukraine just asked the US for a bunch of these babies and its request has been generously granted. This, however, has been the subject of some controversy. But why? How is Ukraine using this weapon? And what could it mean for the war going forward? Let's find out. On Friday, July 7, 2023, the United States declared that it would be supplying Ukraine with cluster bombs, in a decision that President Joe Biden said had been a very difficult one to make. The move was controversial even among America's closest allies. The United Kingdom, Canada, and New Zealand, partners with the United States in the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, all said they were opposed to the move. Spain, a NATO ally, also declared its opposition. The United Nations Human Rights Office also opposed the measure and urged both sides in the war to stop the use of cluster bombs without delay. As mentioned, cluster bombs are dropped from a plane or delivered from an artillery shell, rocket, or missile. The weapon begins as a single container. This container then breaks apart and releases many small bomblets indiscriminately over a wide area. Over 120 countries have banned the use of these weapons because of this indiscriminate nature, fearing the risks that they pose to civilians. The individual cluster bomblets that get released from the initial container also have a high rate of failure. Many of them are duds. These duds can then linger on the ground for decades and accidentally go off when somebody interacts with them. Cluster bombs therefore pose some of the same problems to civilians that landmines do. For example, the United States dropped 260 million cluster munitions in Laos as part of its operations in the Vietnam War. Over 60 years later, large tracts of land in Laos remain uninhabited because of unexploded cluster bomblets in the area. The United States and Russia are not parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. This treaty, which went into effect on August 1, 2010, bans the countries that adhere to it from using, acquiring, developing, stockpiling, and transferring cluster munitions. Countries involved in the convention are even prohibited from assisting other countries from interacting with cluster bombs in any way. They cannot help them manufacture their own cluster weapons, for example. Ukraine is not a signatory to the Convention on Cluster Munitions either, and in April 2023 at the Munich Security Conference, it requested the United States to deliver these weapons, which it has long desired. However, this desire could harm its international image, which up until this point was almost unanimously positive. Amnesty International and other human rights groups condemned the White House's decision to provide the Ukrainian military with cluster bombs, warning of the threat these weapons could pose to civilians during and after the war. United States National Secretary Advisor Jake Sullivan countered the controversy by declaring that the cluster bombs the United States would be sending to Ukraine failed at far less frequent rates than the versions that the Russians had already been using in the war. The United States has a domestic law on the books that bans the production, use, or transfer of cluster bombs which have a failure rate greater than 1%. Sullivan said that American cluster munitions in question fail at less than 2.5%, compared to Russian bombs that have dud rates between 30 and 40%. Nevertheless, by admitting this, he also tacitly admitted that the Biden administration was disregarding the law. Russia's defense and foreign ministry were publicly unfazed by the announcement. They instead dismissed it as an act of desperation. In accepting delivery of the cluster bombs, Ukraine promised that it would not use them on Russian territory. There were other conditions too, which we'll get into in a moment. For Ukraine, a feeling of necessity surrounds the use of cluster bombs. At the beginning of July, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny, admitted that the counteroffensive in Donbass and Zaporizhia that began in June was not making the progress that he had desired. He blamed the slow pace of the operations on a lack of adequate firepower, especially artillery and air support. General Zaluzhny particularly complained about the lack of adequate fighter jets to provide air support, saying that the Western planes he wanted were a generation more advanced than the planes available to him. Ukraine has long desired cluster bombs to more effectively target Russian defenses, formations of tanks and armored vehicles, and troop formations. Because cluster bombs focus their attack on a wide area, the Ukrainians would need less of them to destroy Russian assets, in comparison to the more narrowly targeted weapons Ukraine has been using. Ammunition expenditures would decrease and accuracy would become less important. Given Ukraine's shortage of the artillery shells it desperately needs if its counteroffensive is to make the headway it wants, the delivery of American cluster bombs is a welcome one for Kyiv. A British general, Sir Richard Shirreff, NATO's former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, mentioned that the decision had utility. Arming the Ukrainians with cluster bombs, he said, would make it easier for them to break through Russian lines. He blamed the West for failing to provide adequate firepower early enough, therefore making the use of cluster bombs necessary now. The cluster weapon in question is the dual-purposed improved conventional munition, DPICM. This is an artillery shell that bursts apart and drops 88 separate bomblets over the target area. The cluster shell has a dud rate of around 3%, so its delivery would violate American law. In September 2022, General Zaluzhny wrote an article requesting that the United States provide Ukraine with the DPICM, which is currently being phased out in the US Armed Forces in favor of the CDAEM cluster round, which has a dud rate of 1% or less, in line with American standards first set by the Obama administration. Note that this standard is different from the law, which forbids the transfer of cluster munitions with a failure rate greater than 1%. The Ukrainian top general is now finally getting his wish. Another weapon the Ukrainians badly want is the airdropped Mark 20 Rockeye-2 cluster bomb, also known as the CBU-100, which weighs about 500 pounds in total. It is a gravity bomb that, once released from the air, bursts apart into 247 separate Mark 118 bomblets that rain down over the designated target area. The target area's range can be adjusted based on the altitude that the original container is set to burst apart in. The Mark 118 bomblets are steered by fins at the back and have electrical and mechanical fuses that activate once they are released from the original CBU-100. Once the bomblet's noses hit a hard surface, the ordnance detonates. Reportedly, the Ukrainians do not want to use the Mark 20 Rockeye-2 cluster bomb in its traditional way, because Ukraine already has better cluster-type weapons in its arsenal that can be delivered via HIMARS and other systems. The coming DPICM artillery shells add to this capability. Rather, the Ukrainians seem to want to dismantle the Mark 20 container and place the individual Mark 118 bomblets on drones. These bomblets are designed for maximum penetration against enemy armored assets. The shape of the design allows for puncturing of up to 190 mm of armor. The bomblets are also aerodynamically sound. These factors make them ideal candidates for drone operations against Russian armored formations. Ukraine has proven very effective in the practice of drone warfare. In May, it launched dozens of drone attacks to weaken the Russian lines in preparation for the counteroffensive it launched in Zaporizhia and around Bakhmut in June. Additionally, Ukraine has carried out drone attacks far beyond the Russian lines. Combining the drone capability with the wider area effect of a cluster bomb is something the Ukrainian military is very keen on trying, as it seeks any advantage it can find in the counteroffensive. The Mark 20's manufacturer, a company called Textron Systems, reportedly stopped making this weapon in 2016, following the United States' decision to discontinue sales of the bomb to Saudi Arabia. However, the United States has large stockpiles of the Mark 20 containers and the Mark 118 bomblets, more than enough to provide them in large numbers to the Ukrainian military. So far, the United States has not yet agreed to deliver this weapon to Ukraine. We will need to wait and see if that changes. Although neither the United States nor Ukraine joined the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the decision to use them has still created a lot of controversy among NATO members and other like-minded countries. The United States is by far its most important partner, but Ukraine still needs the support of these other nations which have signed the Convention on Cluster Munitions. These countries provide Ukraine with military and financial aid, and all of this help is needed. Therefore, Ukraine will probably want to be careful in how it uses the cluster munitions when they arrive on the battlefield. So where would the Ukrainian military use these weapons, and where would it be less likely to use them? Ukraine will probably want to use its new cluster artillery shells in areas where its counteroffensive has stalled. This would be in Zaporizhia, in the drive toward the city of Tokmak. Perhaps anticipating this, Russian reports suggest that Ukrainian troops had already struck areas near Tokmak, the probable initial objective for Ukraine on the Zaporizhia front, with cluster munitions on July 11th, although the Institute for the Study of War could not independently verify this. As of July 15th, the front line in Zaporizhia extends from the Dnieper around Kamyansk to Novopil opposite Lyubimivka. All of these sectors could prove enticing targets for cluster bomb attacks, because a breakthrough in Zaporizhia Oblast would put Ukraine in position to cut the Russian land bridge to Crimea. It is a highly strategic area. Ukraine will want to effect that breakthrough any way it can, and the Russian defenses there are heavier than anywhere else on the front. This is part of why Ukraine has made such slow progress in the counteroffensive so far. If there is one area where we can probably bet to see the use of cluster bombs at the front, it would be there in Zaporizhia. Ukrainian forces may also wish to use the cluster bombs in Bakhmut, which has seen the heaviest fighting in the war, and which is another axis of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Ukraine is currently pushing towards Minkivka in the north and towards Ozaryanivka in the south. The Ukrainian units there hope to encircle Russian-occupied Bakhmut and cut the city off from supply lines further to the east. Finally, the Ukrainian military may seek to use its new cluster bombs to support special operations across the Dnieper River opposite Kherson. In deploying its new weapons, Ukraine could use them to disrupt Russian formations over a wider area than its current artillery shells do. Still, Ukraine would need to be careful that unexploded bomblets do not become de facto landmines that impede the movement of its own forces. On the other hand, the unexploded bomblets dropped on Russian lines could also protect the gains that Ukraine makes in its attacks. The area denial factor of these unexploded bombs then works against the Russians, making it harder for them to counterattack. In this way, it's possible to view the tendency toward a high dud rate as a feature of cluster bombs, rather than a bug. Cluster bombs dropped on strategic pieces of real estate like airports, approaches to river crossings, tactically important high ground, and so on, act as improvised, rapidly deliverable landmines that slow down the operations of enemy forces. Every piece of ground Ukraine retakes could be protected with the unexploded bomblets of the cluster weapons it uses on Russian lines. Areas where Ukraine would more likely not want to deploy cluster bombs would be in sectors with even marginal civilian populations. Indeed, one of the terms of the deal that Ukraine made with the Biden administration was an assurance that the American-made cluster bombs would not be used in areas near where civilians are present. This could mean that the artillery batteries equipped with the cluster rounds are less likely to fire near occupied villages, but in the zones between them. All wars are first and foremost political, and large numbers of civilian casualties that come as a result of Ukrainian-deployed cluster bombs would risk undermining the global support that Ukraine has managed to build since Russia's invasion. One of the many reasons why Russia has been condemned for its conduct in the conflict is through its own use of cluster bombs. In early March 2022, human rights groups accused Russia of using cluster bombs in civilian areas. One such attack wound up hitting a school in Kharkiv, the second biggest city in Ukraine. The attack killed 3 civilians, including a child. Although Russia has not ratified the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the attack was still considered a war crime. The move was similar to some of Russia's accused tactics in the Syrian civil war, where cluster bombs were also used, including against civilian targets. In July 2022, Amnesty International came out with a more detailed report, accusing Russia of killing hundreds of civilians in the Kharkiv area through indiscriminate shelling and the use of cluster bombs. The weapons in question were the 9N210 and the 9N235 cluster bombs and scatterable mines that eject from smaller rockets. These mines explode at timed intervals once released. Investigators from Amnesty International looked at 41 strike sites in Kharkiv that resulted in the deaths of 62 civilians and the wounding of 196 more. They said that using these weapons is tantamount to deliberately targeting civilians. This is a violation of international humanitarian law, despite Russia's not being a party to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Russia's use of cluster bombs in Ukraine goes much further than the strikes in Kharkiv. Regions all over Ukraine have been targeted with these weapons. Russia has never denied using cluster bombs, and has been rather keen to point out NATO's use of its own cluster bombs in the Balkans in 1999. Russia has been a fierce critic of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, saying that these munitions are legitimate weapons which have not been banned by international humanitarian law and play a significant role in the defense interests of Russia. It is in incidents such as these that Ukraine's desire for cluster bombs becomes more understandable. If Russia has already used cluster bombs, Ukraine naturally would see no problem with retaliating in a similar way. Despite the history of Russian cluster bomb use, Sergei Shoigu, Russia's Minister of Defense, threatened escalation, saying that Russia would use similar weapons if American cluster bombs wound up being used in the war. Ukraine, for its part, had also used cluster bombs prior to the Biden administration's decision to deliver more of them to the conflict. As early as 2014, Ukraine was using the Soviet-era cluster bombs it had inherited in the Donbass region against pro-Russian separatist forces, although Ukraine denied that it was doing so back then. The new American-made cluster bombs should be a much better performing round than Ukraine's previous stockpiles. General Zaluzny had been very keen on getting his hands on the DPICM. In his September 2022 interview, he stated that it is a much more effective round than the high-explosive artillery shells the United States had been delivering to Ukraine. Unlike cluster ammunition, high-explosive shells hit a single point and explode. Although these impacts create shockwaves and thousands of high-speed shell fragments, the area of effect is much smaller than a cluster bomb. Although the United States has granted Ukraine DPICM artillery rounds, it has not yet granted the Mark 20 Rockeye 2 or the Mark 118 bomblets that it drops. We will need to see if that changes. The Biden administration is probably hoping that it will not need to provide these weapons and risk further alienating international allies and partners. If the DPICM artillery rounds make enough of a difference in the counteroffensive, then there is less of a need to send more cluster bombs to Ukraine and contaminate the country with the duds. That is an important consideration for Ukraine's prospects both during and after the war. Although examples of Russian cluster bomb use in the current conflict abound, the Ukrainians will need to take heed of the example Russia has set. The first delivery of American cluster bombs to Ukraine was confirmed by the Pentagon on July 13th. We must now wait and see how Ukraine exactly will use them on the battlefield and where it will do so. The answers will come shortly. Ukraine's new cluster bombs should prove more effective than the Soviet-era munitions it had been using. But more than any other weapon granted to Ukraine so far in the war, this type of munition divides Western opinion. Since securing Western support for the duration of its war with Russia remains the most important item on the strategic agenda for Ukraine, it will need to be more careful with how it uses cluster bombs than any other weapon in its arsenal. If it uses them in a reckless or less than discriminate way, it will risk undermining the Western support so vital for its war effort. The negative response of so many NATO allies to the news of the Biden administration's decision will undoubtedly provoke caution in the Ukrainian High Command about how these weapons should be deployed. But what do you think? Is it a good idea to give Ukraine cluster bombs? Where would the Ukrainians use them in their offensive operations and how? Do you think they could change the course of the war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. Putin is terrified of F-16s in Ukraine, and he should be. Since basically the beginning of the Russian invasion, Ukraine has been pleading with its Western supporters for advanced fighter jets. For most of the war, the US has been staunchly opposed to giving Ukraine these systems, as they could allow for strikes far behind Russian lines, escalating the conflict. But now officials in Kyiv might be finally getting their wish, in the form of US-made F-16s set to be delivered later this year. As of this video, the training for Ukrainian F-16 pilots has begun in Denmark, and is set to begin in multiple other NATO countries such as the Netherlands. Back at the annual G7 summit in May, with Ukraine's Zelensky as a special guest, US President Joe Biden announced that the US would conduct its own training for Ukrainian F-16 pilots, which it estimated could be completed in under a year, with basic training possibly taking only 4 months. But where might all these jets be coming from? How important are they to Ukraine? And perhaps most importantly, how could they change the outcome of this brutal and unpredictable war? Let's start with the question of where exactly the F-16s might be coming from. There are more than 2,200 F-16s around the world, making it the most popular combat aircraft in use today. But the most likely candidates seem to be jets recently retired by the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. These would likely be the F-16 AM/BM models, which were originally acquired in the 1980s and upgraded in the 1990s. All of these would therefore be aging aircraft with high mileage and old radar systems. But even with these drawbacks, the jet's software allows them to use some of the most modern and deadly weapons in the NATO arsenal, including the AIM-120 air-to-air missiles and stealthy long-range joint air-to-surface standoff missiles, or JASSMs. Reports suggest that the Netherlands in particular was closely involved in the effort to get Washington to approve the F-16 training, helping convince Biden of their need in Ukraine. Interestingly, however, the F-16s aren't coming from the US at all. This is probably partially due to the tensions with China, for which the Pentagon is keeping significant material in reserve in case an air or naval battle breaks out over the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. The other main reason is that US policymakers still worry that too aggressive or successful a strike by Ukraine could force Putin's hand in ways we'd all rather not think about. That was the rationale behind the strategy so far: give Ukraine as many surface-to-air and land capabilities as possible while avoiding the potential of an aerial strike inside Russian territory. But this logic has already been challenged by Ukraine's use of drones in so-called shaping operations in recent weeks, some of which have reached as far as Moscow. Because of this, the authorization for Ukraine to receive F-16s and the associated training has been a matter of tension in Washington for months. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and several others have objected to the idea, essentially claiming that there were too many unknowns and that Ukraine has done well enough without F-16s. So the approval for other countries to ship their F-16s to Ukraine is still a big change, overriding a key condition baked into their initial sale by the US, which prohibited European allies from sending them elsewhere. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was apparently one of the driving forces behind the administration's decision, as well as helping to convince European NATO allies to get on board. Yet even so, it's unclear when any of these countries will actually be supplying the F-16s in question. The Netherlands, Belgium, and Denmark are working towards replacing their current F-16s with more advanced F-35s, but have all held back on actually committing to sending the old jets to Ukraine. Similarly, the UK has offered to provide flight training, but doesn't actually operate any F-16s itself. While this may start to change once the training is complete, there's currently a lot of hesitation from the West about pushing Putin just a little too far and ending up in some sort of nuclear standoff. Some countries like Belgium also worry about diminishing their own capabilities. Not that Belgium is a likely candidate to be invaded by anyone. Others, like Denmark, have stated that they will reconsider sending F-16s if others are also doing so, but that they won't go it alone. The Netherlands and Norway appear to be similarly torn, while other countries with F-16s not in the process of being phased out are much less likely to join in. In a nutshell, at the moment it's pretty clear that even those countries which have declared support for Ukraine's push for jets either can't or aren't willing to provide significant numbers of them in the short to medium term. Once Ukraine actually gets the aircraft, there's another set of problems it needs to deal with. Specifically, they must be able to operate, maintain, and sustain the F-16s, which is not the easiest task. For instance, a March 2023 study by the Congressional Research Service identified several crucial conditions necessary to successfully field the jets. The biggest concerns it identified concern the supply chain. This means acquiring sufficient spare parts, allocating funding for operations and support, implementing a maintenance inventory system, training maintainers, and acquiring an ongoing supply of weapons with which to arm their F-16s. These tasks are difficult enough for countries in peacetime, with previous experience and a wide base of technical knowledge. For Ukraine, they are likely to be even trickier. Of course, if the course of the war so far is anything to judge by, Ukrainians will continue to figure out inventive solutions to logistical issues facing their military. Russians, on the other hand, have no hope of obtaining advanced fighter jets and are stuck using obsolete human wave tactics while trying to avoid kicking off a civil war in their own country. But even accounting for the staggering incompetence of the Russian military, Ukraine certainly still faces some hurdles obtaining and operating even used F-16s. If they take to the skies without plans to support these aircraft, they will break down quickly and most likely become expensive stationary targets for Russian air-to-surface missiles. This is especially true for the F-16, which can require some 18 hours of maintenance for every hour of flight time. Basically, if they do things right and don't rush it, there's a strong possibility that Ukraine won't even be using the F-16s until the end of 2023. This also suggests that many defense experts believe the war will continue for quite some time, despite the incompetence of the Russian armed forces and short mutiny of the Wagner Group PMC. By greenlighting the transfer of the F-16s, the US is essentially admitting that the war will not stop anytime soon, and that Ukraine will need continual upgrades to its firepower in a long-term war of attrition. If Ukraine can get a handle on the jet's supply and maintenance, that's when the training will really start to become important. Like any complex weapon system, the F-16 was designed to fill a particular set of roles in an existing military structure and support certain doctrines of modern warfare. To get the most out of them, the Ukrainians will need to adopt more of the practices and techniques which the plane's design caters to. Fundamentally, the F-16 was designed to help the US Air Force beat the Russian Air Force in aerial combat. Logic follows that the more the Ukrainians can fly them like the US Air Force would, the better the results will be. Of course, other NATO countries have adopted similar practices, but most of these are also quite different from the ways Ukraine has been fielding their existing fighter jets. For one thing, the F-16 was essentially designed to be a lightweight, multi-role fighter capable of doing many different missions well, but not to be the best at any of them. F-16s were definitely not intended to be operated from improvised airfields as Ukraine has been doing with many of its current aircraft. They can be especially susceptible to getting debris caught in their engines, a great way to crash before ever engaging in combat. This brings up the issue of where Ukraine would put the 200 F-16s it's asking for. Rand Corporation analysts John Hone and William Courtney recently assessed that F-16s do best on long, pristine runways. They could face difficulties on the rougher, former Soviet ones dispersed across Ukraine. To bring in Western aircraft, Ukraine might need to repave and potentially extend a number of runways, a process which Russia would likely detect. If only a few airfields were suitable and in known locations, focused Russian attacks could impede Ukrainian F-16s from flying. This is mostly because, idiotic and unprepared as most of Russia's military might be, they still have access to some pretty advanced technology. This is especially true when it comes to air-to-air combat. Modern Russian air fighters such as the MiG-31 and Su-35 can see quite far with their powerful modern radars. They also have R-37 missiles that have a longer range than NATO-supplied AIM-120 AMRAAMs, or advanced medium-range air-to-air missiles. In other words, Russian aircraft can potentially spot Ukrainian F-16s and shoot them down before the Ukrainian pilots see them coming. Some of this has already happened with Ukraine's current fleet of Su-27 and MiG-29 fighters, and the improved capabilities of the F-16 are not enough to change this dynamic. Because of the reach of these Russian fighters, Ukrainian fighter pilots often break off missions early or operate far behind their own front lines. F-16s would operate with the same constraints, limiting their ability to perform air-to-surface missions with relatively short-range weapons like the JDAM bomb guidance kits. Because of this, even once Ukraine receives F-16s, it will still most likely have to rely on drones and other current air platforms for support. There's also the question of how to get the proper armaments Ukraine needs to pair with the F-16s. The best way for Ukraine to capitalize on any F-16s it receives will be advanced Western armaments which can stand up to Russian firepower. The issue, like everything else in a war, these can be staggeringly expensive. For instance, a single AMRAAM costs about $1.2 million, while it takes about 2 years to make one. The US could always provide existing weapons like the AMRAAM from its own stockpiles, but that could leave them depleted in the event of an unexpected conflict, a risk the Pentagon is not willing to take. However, the real tactical and logistical advantages that F-16s would provide to Ukraine are long-term. A major benefit is that it will be easier for Ukraine to maintain aircraft whose parts are supplied by the United States and NATO than their current, outdated aircraft manufactured by Russia. In turn, this could also make it easier for Ukraine to integrate their air force into NATO sometime in the future. And the more Ukraine's arsenal is compatible with NATO's, the better they'll fare, and the worse off Putin will find himself. For instance, Ukraine was previously given AGM-88 high-speed anti-radiation missiles (HARM) to use against ground-based radar systems. As with much of their current military arsenal, they managed to attach the system onto their MiG-29s, but the end result was far from ideal, since Soviet-era fighters were not designed to fire US-manufactured missiles. F-16s with modern software will enable Ukraine to employ HARMs and other modern weapon systems much more effectively. This includes missiles such as the AIM-9 Sidewinder and the AIM-120, which the United States and NATO are likely to provide, will be useful for Ukraine's defense against Russian cruise missiles like the Kh-101 and the Kh-555, and against Iranian-made Shahed kamikaze drones. Ukraine's stockpiles of Soviet S-300 surface-to-air missiles are running out pretty quickly, and there are only so many Patriot missiles available. So even if Russia will still have some superior jets, the F-16's air-to-air capability will definitely help those ground-based defenses last longer, and it's pretty clear that this is necessary. Western military analysts have estimated that Ukraine's combined fleet belonging to air and ground forces has been depleted by more than a third since the Russian invasion began. Ukraine has lost at least 60 of its 145 fixed-wing planes and 32 of 139 helicopters, according to classified US military information leaked on the social media platform Discord in recent months. The Ukrainian Air Force rarely reveals numbers regarding its fleet or other details of tactical importance, including incidents of planes shot down or otherwise destroyed, but officials have acknowledged losses from the more than a year of war, as well as difficulties with the repair and replacement of damaged planes. Another big question is whether the United States will supply powerful JASSMs to use with the F-16s. These deadly, low-detection cruise missiles are incredibly long-range and have a 1,000-pound armor-piercing warhead. It also seems there's a good chance of this happening. Britain has provided the Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missiles, and Ukraine has already put them to use. Storm Shadow is generally similar to the baseline version of JASSM in terms of size, range, employment, and observability, so providing JASSMs would not necessarily be an escalation. F-16s utilizing JASSMs could allow for Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov's stated long-term plan to retake Crimea without a fight. Carrying out such a plan would require cutting off Russian troops in Crimea from their supply lines via the Kerch Strait Bridge, ports like Sevastopol, and the land route from the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. JASSMs could give Ukraine the ability to fire on and destroy logistic hubs like naval bases, ammunition depots, bridges, and command and control facilities deep within Crimea. It could also serve as an alternative to the surface-to-air ATACMS missile, which Ukraine has requested but not yet received. The United States has quite a few more JASSMs than ATACMS, so it might be willing to supply them to augment Ukraine's current arsenal of Storm Shadows. Another area F-16s could be helpful to Ukraine is as a good old-fashioned deterrent. While Putin clearly has no desire for the war to end, he was recently forced to replace General Sergei Surovikin due to his involvement in the Wagner Group's attempted coup against Putin himself. Surovikin was widely known as one of Russia's most trigger-happy commanders, willing to launch indiscriminate attacks against the civilian population of Ukraine. But whoever he gets replaced with may be less gung-ho about ordering air and drone strikes on Kyiv, especially if Ukraine has 200 F-16s with which to respond. While there's little chance that Russian attacks will stop in the east, Ukraine having advanced fighter jets may give it enough of an edge in the air that attacks in the west of the country are diminished. The fact that Ukrainian jets and helicopters have been forced to attack cautiously for the entire war means that F-16s and their longer-range weaponry could prove very useful here. Ukrainian pilots have developed a tactic of flying low, unleashing unguided rockets from Ukrainian territory, then immediately backing away to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Russian aircraft use similar tactics but have the advantage of superior firepower, which allows them to fire rockets and gliding bombs from a greater distance. A recent report from the Royal United Services Institute assessed that because of these tactics, even a small number of Western fighters could have a major deterrent effect. While F-16s likely will not grant Ukraine air superiority, they will make the defense of the country's airspace easier, and if paired with JASSMs or similar weapons, provide an important means of launching the type of long-range weapons which are likely necessary to force Russia out of Crimea and other fortified areas. A group of Ukrainian parliament members speaking at the German Marshall Fund in Washington in April said they wanted the F-16 because its radar can locate targets on the ground hundreds of miles away, allowing pilots to stay safely over Ukrainian-held territory while launching weapons into Russian-occupied areas. In addition to defense and deterrence, this also suggests that F-16s could feature in the later stages of the counteroffensive currently underway, which could take the entire rest of the year. Colonel Yuri Inat, a spokesman for the Ukrainian Air Force, seemed to confirm this, telling the New York Times that F-16s could provide cover for Ukrainian troops trying to advance and hold formerly occupied areas. He noted that it could also be used to cut off Russian planes that have started launching guided missiles more than 30 miles from the Ukrainian front line, to defend the sea route that lets Ukrainian grain leave the country and to push further into the Russian-occupied oblasts. All of this helps explain why the Kremlin seems so nervous about the possibility of F-16s in Ukrainian hands. When it became clear that the US would greenlight their training and eventual transfer, Russian diplomats had a minor meltdown. First, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rybakov said any transfer of the US jets to Ukraine would be pointless, since Russia's capabilities are more than enough to end the special military operation whenever they want. Now, by this point, we probably don't need to tell you that that's pure BS. When that was pointed out, Russian Ambassador to the United States, Anatoly Antonov, went on to claim that even if the F-16s were transferred, they couldn't possibly be effective, since Ukraine lacks the proper infrastructure, pilots, and maintenance personnel. While this is slightly more true, given the country's incredible adaptability so far, there's no reason to think that Ukraine can't make F-16s work, given the right amount of time and training. The Kremlin knows this, and it seems to be making their threats increasingly desperate. When the statements by Antonov and Rybakov failed to scare NATO or the US, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov took the stage during a speech at a military conference in Tajikistan. He claimed that we must keep in mind that one of the modifications of the F-16 can accommodate nuclear weapons. If they do not understand this, then they are worthless as military strategists and planners. This is obviously pretty ironic considering Russia's continual failures in military planning for the last year, but also shows a deep-seated worry from top officials. They likely don't think that the US would ever give Ukraine nuclear warheads, but know that even if F-16s do not change the battle space in the short term, they will bring Ukraine closer to the West and increase the country's military resilience. The West's response to these threats was also summed up pretty well in the reply to Lavrov by Pentagon spokesperson John Kirby that, if you're worried about Ukrainian military capabilities, then you should take your troops and leave Ukraine. This back and forth over F-16s highlights a larger trend in the war, that Ukraine's warfighting increasingly looks like that of the West, rather than a former Soviet satellite state. Because Russia failed so badly to understand the depth of Ukrainian resolve, every step Putin and his cronies take pushes Ukraine towards NATO, the EU, and the US. By the end of the war, whenever that might come, Ukraine will have extremely close military, economic, and political ties to Europe and America. The F-16s are just the latest part of this broader shift, but the fact that their transfer has been approved is another sign that the Ukraine of 2021 is not the same as the one we see today. War has transformed the country into a major regional military power, with advanced equipment and some of Europe's most battle-hardened troops. Even though Putin somehow hasn't learned his lesson yet, there's no doubt that Ukraine will play a major role in the future of European security. But what do you think? What does the transfer of F-16s to Ukraine mean for the future of the conflict? And will it be enough to overcome Russia's military? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis. Trying to defend yourself in a war against Russia is no joke. In its efforts to defend itself against Putin's aggressive invasion, Ukraine has needed all the help it can get. Here's how a shipment of US Vietnam War weapons could help Ukraine turn the tide against Russia's military. After Russia invaded its smaller neighbor in February, the United States offered to evacuate Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky from the capital. But in a now famous statement of his resolve, Zelensky responded that the fight is here. I need ammunition, not a ride. And soon Western countries were happy to grant his wish. In the months since the war began, the US, NATO, and others have supplied Ukraine with an enormous amount of military aid. In fact, the United States alone has contributed over $18.6 billion since February. This has mostly taken the form of lethal modern weaponry, including the High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, or HIMARS, Javelin anti-tank missiles, self-destructing Phoenix Ghost drones, and many others. Weapons like these stopped the invasion in its tracks and have helped Ukraine successfully fight back Russian troops all year. As the war transitioned from urban combat to a devastating artillery slugfest in the east of the country, obtaining new firepower has become a major factor in success or defeat. Accordingly, in the past few months, Western assistance to Ukraine has stepped up again. It has started to allow Ukrainian troops to achieve artillery superiority over Russia, driving them out of major cities like Kherson. Ukraine is now firing as many artillery shells as Russia, while satellite-guided targeting is making their strikes longer range and more precise. But modern weaponry isn't the only technology making an appearance on the battlefield. Recently, the US has once again expanded its security assistance to Ukraine. In addition to contemporary weapons, they have made plans to supply Ukraine with upgraded armaments from the era of the Vietnam War. Other NATO countries are expected to follow suit, potentially supplying Ukrainians with a major new source of firepower. While many consider them more fit for a museum, these older weapon systems could still be lethal. They could even help Ukraine counter some of Russia's biggest new threats. But what exactly are these weapons, and how much of an edge will they give Ukraine in the coming months? The main piece of Vietnam-era military hardware currently being delivered to Ukraine are MIM-23 Hawk missile systems. Developed by Raytheon from 1952 onwards, Hawk stands for Homing All the Way Killer, a nod to the missile's guided targeting. A medium to long-range surface-to-air missile, the Hawk was first put into service in 1959. In those days, the US was increasing its involvement in Vietnam, where the Hawk was used extensively. Designed as a more mobile counterpart to the even older MIM-14 Nike Hercules missile, the Hawk emphasized portability over range and altitude. Full of complex components, the original system was also notoriously unreliable and prone to breakdowns. It had a kill-shot probability of just over 50% and an average time of only 43 hours between repairs. Because of this, the US military spent decades updating the Hawk missiles, partially through the addition of a semi-active radar homing guidance system. This radar upgrade vastly improved the Hawk's accuracy, and the new model, known as the Improved Hawk or iHawk, entered service in 1971. Over the next 20 years, the iHawk continued to be upgraded with the addition of electronic jamming measures and new warheads for use against short-range targets. These chances increased the iHawk's killshot percentage to over 85%, making it into a potent weapon. The models being sent to Ukraine are slightly older, but can intercept aerial targets 45 to 50 kilometers, 28 to 31 miles away, at an altitude of 65,000 feet, 20,000 meters. Using solid fuel propellant, the Hawks can reach a maximum speed of Mach 2.4. Each missile is roughly 1,300 pounds, 600 kilograms, and 17 feet, 5.2 meters, in length, with a 119-pound fragmentation warhead that can deal some serious damage. Hawk missiles are definitely outdated. They were retired by the US Marine Corps in 2002 and replaced by the more powerful Patriot system even earlier. The US has so far refused to send Patriot missiles to Ukraine, since doing so would require US soldiers on the ground to operate. Even so, Hawks are a serious upgrade to the Stinger missiles Ukraine has been given so far. While Stingers can be carried by a single soldier, they have far less range and destructive power. In contrast, Hawk missiles are better known for shooting down higher-altitude Russian fighter jets. They can also more effectively counter the Iranian-made Shahed kamikaze drones, which Russia has been using to wreak havoc on Ukraine's cities. The main advantage of the Shahed drones is that they are cheap and numerous. Russia has reportedly ordered over 2,400 of them from Iran. The drones are fired in groups, so even if most are shot down, a few can usually get through to dive bomb their unlucky target. Considering Ukraine only has so many surface-to-air missiles, there is a high chance that this keeps happening. And since each Shahed drone costs only $20,000, it's a waste to destroy them with powerful air defenses like the long-range NASAMS missiles, which can cost over $1.2 million per shot. But Hawk missiles could be the perfect solution for countering the threat from kamikaze drones. While not nearly as cheap as Shahed drones, their age does make them inexpensive for missiles, at roughly $250,000 each. And while the US hasn't disclosed how many Hawk missiles it currently has or is sending to Ukraine, there are probably a lot of them. At the peak of their production in the 1980s, the US had over 27,000 Hawk missiles in its inventory. While most of these are less advanced than the later models, they could provide a real boost to Ukrainian firepower. There's just one hitch in this plan: the Hawk launchers. The missiles are transported and fired from rolling M192 launchers, which can be wheeled along the ground with 3 Hawk missiles mounted on the back. The issue? The US might not have any in working condition. Because of their extended time in storage, an American official told Reuters that the country's Hawk launchers are in disrepair. However, one partial solution to this has come from an unlikely source: Spain. The European country announced that it would send 4 of its own Hawk launchers to the Ukraine, to be paired with the refurbished US missiles. Ukraine may also create some homemade solutions, as they've successfully adapted lots of other old-school military technology. The first Hawk missiles will likely be on their way to Ukraine soon, especially since they are being sent through the Presidential Drawdown Authority, or PDA. The PDA is a legal tool allowing the US president to transfer military equipment from storage without congressional approval in emergencies. The Biden administration has already issued the PDA extensively to support Ukraine. Since August 2021, it has ordered 11 drawdowns of military equipment into the country. Congress has been on board as well, increasing the cap of the drawdowns from $100 million to nearly $11 billion for this year. Hawk missiles are just the latest part of this, and despite their age, they could prove to be a valuable piece of military assistance. Ukraine will certainly need all the weaponry it can get hold of, as the conflict doesn't look likely to stop anytime soon. And as it drags on, odd weapons deals like this one could become much more common. Why? Mainly because the war has shaken up the global arms industry, creating sometimes surprising results like the Hawk missiles being sent to Ukraine. It's dramatically increased the demand for weapons by both Russia and Ukraine, but also by surrounding countries worried about more Russian aggression. In another recent example of this, Poland has signed a $5.8 billion defense contract with South Korea, far from one of its usual suppliers of weaponry. The deal includes hundreds of artillery rocket launchers, along with tanks and howitzers that Poland hopes will beef up its deterrence against Russia. And South Korea is just one of a number of countries whose weapons are now in high demand. Iran's choice to begin supplying Russia with drones is also a sign of this, as is Turkey's recent decision to sell similar weapons to Ukraine. Month by month, more countries seem to be getting sucked into the conflict, and since Russia accounts for nearly 20% of the global arms trade, its recent battlefield failures could also cause a steep decline in demand for their products. As this happens, China may also begin to take Russia's place as a major weapons supplier. Many other countries, from India to Bulgaria, are already working to create self-sufficient defense industries, in another sign of geopolitical change. Just like the Hawk missiles heading to Ukraine, these unusual decisions are all a product of the massive disruptions caused by 9 months of war in Europe. And as weapons continue to flood into the country, more unexpected changes will probably keep coming. But what do you think? Will the Hawk missiles give Ukraine the edge it needs to win the war? Will we see more unusual weapons deals in the coming year? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more military analysis from the military experts, make sure you subscribe.
As tank, artillery and air battles rage across eastern Ukraine, on a scale not seen since the Second World War, Europe and America have reacted with alarm, scrambling to provide money, advice, weapons and ammunition to support the Ukrainian army. Russia has thrown thousands of tanks and armored combat vehicles into the war. High on the wish list of Ukrainian President Zelensky's generals was always the M1A2 Abrams main battle tank. On 25th of January 2023, US President Joe Biden announced that 31 Abrams tanks would be sent to Ukraine. But how will a tank that was designed in the 1970s and first fielded in the mid-1980s fare against significantly upgraded Russian tanks in the third decade of the 21st century? Is Vladimir Putin right to be terrified of the M1 Abrams? Let's crunch some of the numbers and get a sense of where the Abrams comes from, what it can do, how it might make an impact on the battlefields of Ukraine, and why Vladimir Putin should be afraid. To understand the birth of the Abrams and its current variant, the M1A2, we need to go right back to the Cold War, between 1945 and 1990, where NATO and the Soviet Union were squaring up against each other in Central Europe. Throughout these decades, the most likely conflict between the two sides seemed to be a massive ground war fought in West Germany. In the 1970s, the main American battle tank, the M60, was becoming obsolete. A replacement was needed, one that was designed for high mobility in modern armored ground warfare and that could defeat the latest generation of Soviet armor. Some early US-German collaboration looked at producing a tank together. The Germans were also looking to replace the Leopard 1. But this MBT-70 program was expensive and the tank design problematic. American designers started again. In 1973, at the heart of the requirements for a new tank were that it could survive a strike by a Soviet tank gun at 800 meters and mount a 105mm main armament. Proposals came in from Chrysler and General Motors. There were several issues to be considered. The Chrysler proposal had a gas turbine engine, while the General Motors design offered a diesel. This had implications for cost and reliability. In the mid-1970s, there was considerable interest in a new British defensive composite armor innovation called Cobham armor, which through a clever and highly classified technique of layering ceramic tiles and open spaces in such a way as to channel, deflect, and dissipate the intense heat and impact of an anti-tank round. Although early models of the new tank design that would become the Abrams M1 mounted a 105mm gun, it was soon clear that a 120mm would be much more potent. The armored warfare doctrine of the time emphasized being able to strike the enemy at long range before he could get in a first shot. It seems that for most of the evaluation process, the General Motors demonstration model was favored. However, at the last minute, the decision was overturned by then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who wanted to hear all the arguments again. He finally decided in favor of the Chrysler version. There may have been a bit of DC politics involved. The M1 tank acquired an official name Abrams after General Creighton Abrams, a former tank commander in Patton's Third Army in the Second World War, and who had worked hard in the 1960s and 70s to push forward US main battle tank design. The original M1 Abrams tank came into service in 1980. Over 3,000 were produced between 1979 and 1985, many with a 105mm gun. But a few years later, the M1 was being replaced by an upgraded version, the M1A1. These all had a 120mm main gun. Nearly 5,000 M1A1s were produced between 1986 and 1992, 4,000 for the American Army and 400 for the US Marines. Each tank cost over $4 million. The Abrams has a crew of 4 and weighs 57 tons, although different models can weigh as much as 78 tons. It can reach speeds of 67 kilometers an hour and has a range of 465 kilometers. The M829A2 armor-piercing shell can deal with newer Russian tanks, the T-80 and T-90, which have Contact 5 explosive reactive armor, ERA. In addition to the 120mm main armament, the Abrams mounts a Coxal machine gun and a 50 caliber heavy machine gun on top of the turret. The Abrams is heavier than most current main battle tanks and it's bulky, but it's also quite agile. One nickname it has acquired is Whispering Death, because the gas turbine engine is relatively quiet. The Abrams also had a lot of safety features designed specifically to protect the crew. Crew survivability has always been an important part of the Abrams design concept. The crew is always the most precious asset of any tank, so the tank ammunition is stored in the back compartment of the tank turret and carefully sealed away from the crew. This has turned out to be a vital design innovation. Social media is now full of clips of Russian tanks in Ukraine catastrophically exploding, their turrets flung up into the air because the ammunition is stored, unprotected, in the crew compartment. The M1A1 has improved defenses. Now the composite armor also includes screens of heavy depleted uranium and twin sets of smoke discharges. Some models have anti-missile jamming measures.
The rear of the turret has blowout panels to redirect blast in the event of ammunition explosions. The crew interior has Kevlar lining around the turret to protect against spalling, which is caused when high-velocity rounds strike the outside of the tank and cause fragments of metal to flake off at high speed and bounce around inside the tank. This thing is combat-proven. Here's what we mean. The M1 Abrams crews spent years of training during the 1980s in the wooded, mountainous, and population-heavy arena of Germany as they prepared to conduct defensive operations against a Soviet assault. It was highly ironic, therefore, that the Abrams' first actual combat deployment was in an offensive role in the unpopulated deserts of the Middle East. Nearly 2,000 Abrams were sent to the Gulf to help force Saddam Hussein's army out of Kuwait. The Abrams performed excellently and was superior to the Iraqi T-55s, T-62s, and even the relatively modern T-72s that equipped Saddam's army. The Abrams were highly mobile, easy to operate, and had highly advanced command, communications, and fire control systems that enabled small numbers of Abrams to speedily maneuver, engage, and defeat many times more Soviet-model tanks at greater ranges. Hits against Iraqi armor were achieved as far as 4 kilometers away. Soviet tanks struggled to achieve half that distance. The Battle of Easting 73 was but one example of the flexible firepower that the Abrams could bring to bear. During the whole Gulf War, although some were hit by friendly fire and some had to be destroyed to prevent them falling into enemy hands, few Abrams were hit by enemy action, and none were destroyed. Of a force of nearly 2,000, only 23 were damaged or destroyed. The Abrams was clearly more than a match for Soviet-era armor. Okay, now let's talk about improvements, combat lessons, and also challenges. Modifications to the Abrams were made as a result of lessons learned during the Gulf War. Improvements were made to the fire control system and weapon sights, but the innovations kicked up several notches when the new M1A2 version of the Abrams was revealed. Development work had begun in 1988, and the first models were produced in 1992. This was a significant evolution of the Abrams platform. The tank commander now had an independent thermal viewer and a weapon station and navigation equipment. The fire control system was again upgraded. Many of the improvements involved adding more computer and data management capacity. This also meant that the internal cooling system needed to be upgraded because of the extra heat generated by the new IT systems. More combat lessons were learnt the hard way during the 2003 Second Gulf War, also known as the Iraq War, and the insurgency aftermath. Further modifications to the Abrams were made. For instance, combat identification panels were important to help reduce the risk of friendly fire incidents. There were some tank-on-tank engagements before the Saddam regime collapsed. In one incident, Abrams tanks destroyed 7 T-72s in a matter of minutes at very close range. The Iraqi tank crews were poorly trained and unable to react with sufficient speed. Having strong situational awareness and good communications is every bit as important as having thick armor and a big gun. Since the creation of the tank in 1916, all tank crews have struggled to achieve all-round ease of visibility. It's simply very difficult to see what you're doing, whether driving, firing a gun, or commanding a tank in battle, when peering out of a narrow vision slit. This has always made tanks vulnerable at night or in enclosed areas, such as forests and urban areas. Ideally, the commander sits with his head out of the turret so he can clearly see in every direction from a high position, but he is then, of course, at high risk of getting targeted by a sniper. Urban fighting in Iraq against terrorists and local militia forces caused major problems for the Abrams and the crews. The Abrams was highly vulnerable to close-up infantry creeping up on the side and rear of the vehicle, hiding in alleys and buildings. They were armed with rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank guided missiles, mines, IEDs, and even a heavy machine gun or a simple petrol bomb. At short range, many of these weapons could be sufficient to knock a tank out or damage it sufficiently in order to cause it to retire or be abandoned. You certainly do not have to destroy a tank in order to render it ineffective. Missiles were fired at tracks and wheels. Rocket-propelled grenades struck the less well-protected top and rear of the tank. Some parts of a tank are very vulnerable. Pieces of communications equipment and vision slits can be damaged and reduce the effectiveness of the tank. Even a brick can damage a radio aerial. Some Abrams had to be hastily abandoned when extra fuel stored on the outside of the tank burst into flames. This time the conflict was primarily in an urban environment and there was little opportunity for the Abrams to play to its strengths, engaging enemy vehicles at long range. The Abrams was a child of the Cold War, intended to face heavily armed threats to its front. Total losses inflicted on Abrams tanks during this second Gulf War were much more sobering to contemplate. By 2005, 80 tanks had been put out of action, of which 63 had to be returned to America for major repairs, and 17 were so damaged that they had to be written off as beyond repair. Nearly 2 years later, more than 500 Abrams had been returned to the US for repair work as a result of the combat in Iraq. In 2008, a particular Russian anti-tank rocket-propelled grenade, the RPG-29, was considered a very serious threat to the Abrams. Its innovative missile design gave it a double charge, which allowed it to first penetrate the reactive armor and then also the composite armor underneath it. In accordance with the lessons learnt in Iraq, a new modification kit was introduced, specifically designed to deal with the particular vulnerabilities that the Abrams was experiencing in the grueling city fighting. It was called Tusk, the Tank Urban Survival Kit. There was also a Tusk 2 kit. The Tusk program offered a series of modules and components that could be fitted to the tank or removed according to the tactical situation the crew was facing. The kits provided improved protection, extra firepower, and better situational awareness. Some of the features included add-on reactive armor, extra smoke and anti-personnel grenade discharges, transparent protection around the commander's heavy machine gun position, a thermal sight for the machine gun, 360-degree and rear-fitted cameras, and a telephone at the back of the tank to allow direct communication with the accompanying infantry. Slat armor could be added. These are forms of cages or metal grills around particularly vulnerable parts of the tank, such as the rear and crew areas. The Russians have been experimenting with these in Ukraine. But in poorly trained hands, the Abrams could be just as vulnerable as any other tank. From 2010, the Americans equipped the new Iraqi army with a vast array of combat equipment. 140 M1A1 Abrams were given to the Iraqi Defense Forces. In 2014, they were used against ISIS. However, within 3 months, over 40 of the tanks had been destroyed, damaged, or captured. At the end of 2014, the Iraqi army had only 40 Abrams tanks still operational. It's a useful reminder that the skills, training, morale, and capabilities of the crew remain at the heart of the effectiveness of the Abrams. Other packages of upgrades, separate enhancement packages (SEP), versions 1, 2, and 3, have been introduced to increase the capabilities and lifespan of the M1A1 and M1A2. The crew have received better digital maps, better interfaces, an improved cooling system, a remotely operated weapon system, and better front and side armor. But the enhancements themselves are causing problems. The weight of the tank is slowly creeping upwards. The original weight of the M1 was set at 50 tons. Enhancement packages can take the latest version of the M1A2 to well over 70 tons. There is a limit to the amount of improvements that can be made. The more weight the tank is carrying, the less mobile it will be. The more high-technology add-ons and lower-technology armor upgrades that are introduced, the more difficult, costly, and complex it becomes to service the tank. The Abrams is undeniably old, and there is no Abrams replacement yet in sight, meaning the Abrams will have to remain the US main battle tank for many more years. A study in October 2023 by the US Army Science Board concluded that the M1 Abrams would not be sufficient to support combat missions from 2040 onwards. That seems a long way away, but the Abrams is a third-generation main battle tank, and researchers and designers are now contemplating what a fifth-generation tank would look like, and urgently updating these views based on what they are learning from the war in Ukraine. At present, the view seems to be that the new tanks will need to be lighter, with a hybrid propulsion, larger guns, hypersonic missiles, and more effective passive and active protection systems. Advanced radar and sensors will make for a more and more transparent domain. It will become easier to detect weapons, see and strike targets on the battlefield. As we noted earlier, in January 2023, President Joe Biden announced that over 30 Abrams tanks would be sent to Ukraine, and that they would be the more up-to-date M1A2 versions. This sent ripples of excitement throughout the Western world and caused serious concern within the Kremlin. In late September 2023, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky confirmed that all 31 had arrived. Well, first of all, we should probably take a look at the political angles that can dominate and dictate the progress of a conflict. Western countries are generally highly and actively supportive of the Ukrainian cause, but there have also been expressions of concern that Putin should not be overly provoked. This concern has changed slowly. The nature of the brutality of the Russian assault and the extensive numbers of human rights abuses has quickly become clear. Ukraine is fighting for its very existence. Billions of dollars of aid have already been sent to Ukraine. Other weapons systems have followed. Ukraine has received hundreds of armored personnel vehicles, cross-country vehicles, mobile artillery pieces, small arms ammunition, artillery shells, helmets, first aid kits. America and many EU countries have provided intelligence support and military training in a range of ways. One problem is that Ukraine is receiving so many different types of equipment from so many different countries that training, maintenance, and logistics are proving a significant challenge. However, this has been slightly alleviated by the high degree of standardization and interoperability between NATO countries, particularly regarding ammunition types. Ukraine was calling for military equipment from as soon as the conflict began in February 2022, but there was reluctance among NATO countries to hand over the most advanced NATO military hardware, such as F-16 fighter jets, main battle tanks, and long-range missiles, for fear of triggering Russian red lines and escalating the conflict. It was only well over a year after the war began that these more advanced systems began to arrive, and the quantities are still very small. 31 Abrams tanks is a relatively small amount, barely 2 American tank companies or 1 Ukrainian tank battalion. Being realistic, this is unlikely to make a significant military impact on a battlefield in which thousands of tanks are involved. So what would the strengths and weaknesses of the Abrams look like in a Ukrainian theater of war? The M1A2 and even the M1A1 with a package of upgrades would still present a very formidable opponent to the Russian armor currently being destroyed in their thousands by the Ukrainian army. Most of the tanks fielded by the Russians are upgraded versions of the same T-72 platform that the Abrams easily defeated during the Gulf War. Many are older. Other Russian tanks present, albeit in smaller numbers, are the T-80U and the T-90. The Abrams is more than a match for these vehicles, and in many ways, the Abrams has been training all its life for this battlefield confrontation. There have been many rumors that a highly capable new Russian main battle tank might be entering the Ukrainian battlefields. The T-14, seen on display during Russian victory parades for some years, was reported to be a highly advanced piece of equipment, with a 3-man crew and a remote-controlled turret, a new 125mm main armament that can fire anti-tank shells and anti-tank missiles, and carry an extensive array of very modern active defensive measures. This would have made it a 4th or even 5th generation tank, and it could have presented a very serious threat to the Abrams. But these reports seem to have been greatly exaggerated. It now seems likely that only a handful of non-battle-ready unfinished prototypes are in existence, and that the concept may never be put into full production. But let's now take a look at the battlefield environment. It's a high-intensity and high-casualty conflict, which evokes strong parallels from many parts of the last 100 years of warfare. We can see the brutal trench warfare and artillery barrages of the First World War. We can see examples of major armored, mechanized, and airborne operations that could have come straight out of the Second World War. And of course, we can see the cutting-edge technology of the most modern forms of warfare, including guided missiles, drones, electronic countermeasures, combat helicopters, and fast jets. In this mix, the main battle tank has struggled. There have certainly been many long-range instances of tank-on-tank combat, but thousands have fallen victim to artillery, cheap drones, and highly capable, man-portable anti-tank missiles. The vast array of sensors, including drones, satellites, handheld cameras, and social media, make camouflage and concealment of tanks and other armored vehicles very difficult. This combination of threats from drones, artillery, and missiles have caused many analysts to declare that the main battle tank, whether Russian, Ukrainian, or American, is now more or less obsolete. Russian tank and armored fighting vehicle losses have been absolutely staggering. United States intelligence assessments suggest that Russia may have lost 2,300 of the 3,500 tanks they have available. Cooler heads have since argued that it's far too early to make that call. Many of the Russian tank losses in particular were due to very poor offensive tactics, low morale, and a major design flaw, with the ammunition automatic loading carousel that effectively has the crew sitting right on top of the tank shells without any protection. The M1A2 would face the full array of combat challenges, just like any other main battle tank: drones, trenches, mines, artillery, anti-tank guided weapons, and guided missiles. Mines in particular have greatly reduced the mobility of all combat vehicles. Ukraine is now the most heavily mined place on Earth. On some parts of the front line, as many as 5 mines have been laid per square meter. But the Abrams is a well-designed and upgraded weapons platform that can move fast, protect the crew, and strike hard at the enemy. What would be crucial in enhancing the performance of the Abrams would be well-trained crews, solid tactics, and reliable maintenance and support. In Iraq, it was clearly demonstrated what happens if you give a top-of-the-range tank to a poorly trained crew with low morale. Giving the Abrams, or the Challenger 2 and Leopard 2 for that matter, to the Ukrainian army would also mean having to ensure that the Ukrainian tank crews, mechanics, and logisticians were also up to the correct standard in order to avoid seeing the tanks abandoned on the battlefield. So far, the Ukrainians have proven themselves highly skilled at adapting to operate many different modern American and European weapons systems, and their morale has always been high. But this does not guarantee success. Offensive combat operations in Ukraine are extremely difficult, dangerous, and costly, as both Russians and Ukrainians have found out. The Ukrainians are now quite realistic about the difficulties, particularly since their summer offensive operations were largely a disappointment, failing to drive the Russians back. America has also sent over 100 Bradley mechanized infantry combat vehicles to Ukraine, the type that accompanied Captain H.R. McMaster's Abrams tanks into the Battle of Easting 73 in 1991. The Ukrainians love them because they offer far superior protection to the crew than any equivalent ex-Soviet infantry combat vehicles could do, but as many as 24 Bradleys have been destroyed when they were used in the Ukrainian summer counteroffensive. The nature of modern warfare means that in order for a ground offensive to have a good chance of success, it needs effective air cover, accurate and responsive artillery support, and timely intelligence. It's a combination of weapon systems working together in close cooperation that wins battles. There are several pieces of American military equipment that will cause Vladimir Putin some major heart flutters. F-16 fighter jets in serious numbers would be one. Long-range guided missiles such as the US MGM-140 Army Tactical Missile Systems, ATACMS, are another. In terms of frontline ground combat, Putin's greatest fear would probably be to see significant quantities of M1A2 main battle tanks, by which we mean hundreds rather than dozens, arriving in Ukraine. This would mean several things. It would mean that any political concerns about provoking Putin and the strength of the resolve of the United States government would have been resolved in Ukraine's favor. It would show a strong political lead to the rest of Europe. It would reduce issues of training and problems of compatibility if the Ukrainian main tank force was comprised of the same tank type. If several hundred Abrams arrived, it would be fair to assume that they also would come with training, maintenance, and other logistical support packages. There are thousands of Abrams M1A1 and M1A2 main battle tanks in storage in the United States. Perhaps not quite an inexhaustible supply, but now probably enough to outnumber Russian tanks on the battlefield. The arrival of M1A2 would provide the Ukrainian armed forces with a war-winning, combat-proven tank that can defeat any Russian tank on the battlefield and give Ukraine a highly capable strike force to allow it to consider serious counterattack options. The Abrams will greatly increase Ukraine's chances of military success. And that is what will keep Mr. Putin awake at night. But what do you think? Will the M1A2 be a game changer for Ukraine in the Russo-Ukraine war? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts. The US recently announced the next generation of Abrams tank. How would it fare in an out-and-out tank duel with Russia's best? A remote 30mm chain gun, 360-degree panoramic daytime, thermal and laser targeting, smaller crew, modular upgradability, next-generation digital sensors, AI and drone pairing capabilities, parallel diesel and electric power modes, a lethal main gun. Welcome to the AbramsX. After decades of incremental improvements, the 40-year-old battle-proven M1A2 Abrams main battle tank (MBT) is finally set to receive a comprehensive next-generation overhaul. Last October, General Dynamics Land Systems previewed its concept for the AbramsX. In a demonstration featuring a full-scale mock-up laced with futuristic upgrades and design improvements, the new AbramsX offered a glimpse into the future of tank technology. In today's video, we'll see what the newly designed AbramsX improves upon and how it might fare in an out-and-out tank duel against Russia's best offering, the T-14 Armata. American tank technology did not change much during the Cold War. After World War II, the American military relied heavily on its first-generation main battle tanks, the M48 Patton, and its successor, the M60. Both saw heavy service either in NATO or Vietnam. However, by the 1970s, progressive Soviet tank improvements had prompted Western militaries to revisit their decades-old tank design. In the 1960s, the US and West Germany began collaborating on a replacement main battle tank expressly designed to defeat the Soviet T-62. By 1970, their joint project, the MBT-70, had incorporated the latest weapon, engine, and suspension technologies, but the resulting platform was far too heavy and expensive to produce as a whole. The project was eventually scrapped, prompting the US Army to reallocate its remaining funding to develop a viable alternative. This they did. Throughout the 1970s, Chrysler Defense won its competition with General Motors for its M1 prototype, a design that was soon awarded a $20 billion development contract from the Department of Defense. In 1979, the M1 Abrams began rolling off production lines, a revolutionary design with sleek armor, improved targeting, and better cross-country travel capabilities than anything else in its class. General Dynamics purchased Chrysler Defense in the mid-1970s and has continued production of the M1 Abrams to the present day. Costing well over $6 million per unit, over the span of 40 years, General Dynamics has produced more than 10,000 Abrams tanks. Remaining in service for decades after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Abrams racked up an impressive combat record in the Persian Gulf War and subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Admittedly, since the Abrams has never engaged in a tank duel with a vehicle of similar specifications, it's hard to know how it might perform in a fair fight. During the 1991 Gulf War, American M1s destroyed 37 Soviet T-72s, the best enemy tank at the time, while sustaining 0 casualties. It had a comparable, though slightly less, lopsided service record in Iraq. Throughout these conflicts, the Abrams played to its primary strengths, especially its impressive firing range and durability. Able to engage enemy vehicles at more than 2,500 meters, its frontal armor could survive direct armor-piercing rounds fired from other Abrams tanks, while its depleted uranium and British-designed composite ceramic Cobham armor covering the rest of the vehicle kept 4-person crews safe from harm. In the 1990s and 2000s, General Dynamics began producing an upgraded version of the Abrams, the M1A2, a system which made full use of the latest technologies. The M1A2 added thermal night vision imaging capabilities, integrated digital displays with better maps and communications, inter-vehicle information systems, improved cooling, and an overhauled transmission. Starting last year, 2021, the US Army finally began retiring the M1A1 Abrams from service. While the M1A1 is set to become a relic of a bygone era, the US military anticipates keeping its successor, the M1A2, in the ranks until well past 2050, a remarkable testament to the resilience and modularity of the Abrams' main battle tank design. But wait, if upgraded M1A1-2 Abrams are forecasted to remain in service for at least 3 more decades, why announce the AbramsX? Well, as the popular song goes, the times, they are a-changing. With the pace of technological change now moving faster than ever, militaries are beginning to unveil the next generation of smart tanks, ones that shoot, move, and communicate on a different plane than their predecessors. The AbramsX is still firmly riding the future war hype train, so we shouldn't get too carried away envisioning its potential role in the American Army of the future. The demonstrator version that debuted on the show floor last October looks like it will capitalize on cutting-edge computer processing, AI, and drone integration technologies, but it will still have to undergo plenty of tests before it's approved for manufacture. Before the AbramsX enters the battlefield, we'll continue to see the current production version of the Abrams tank, the M1A2 System Enhancement Package (SEP) version 3, and its successor currently in development, the M1A2 SEP version 4, for decades to come. So when it finally does enter service, where might the AbramsX diverge from its predecessors? Bristling with a full suite of fancy electronic systems, the AbramsX addresses the 2 biggest complaints leveled at the M1A2: its weight and power. The current Abrams variation weighs in at a whopping 73.6 tons, a number that started at around 60 tons in the first Abrams variant but grew more cumbersome with each successive upgrade. Because of its weight, the Abrams devours an astonishing amount of fuel, 10 gallons just to start the engine, close to 2 gallons per mile, and up to 10 gallons per mile when idling. When you factor in how difficult it is to transport heavy vehicles around the globe and resupply them with that much fuel, shrinking the Abrams' logistical footprint seems like a no-brainer. Carving off the excessive weight, the AbramsX comes in at 60 tons, a feat achieved by moving the crew out of the main turret forward in the tank's hull, adding an autoloader for the main gun, and removing the turret's heavy armor. Some tankies might see the loss of a crew member as a possible weakness in the AbramsX. Sure, the autoloader is nice, but having an extra crew member on board can be a blessing, not a curse. Yes, there's less space, but the extra crew members can help operate secondary and tertiary weapon systems, help repair broken parts, fly drones, deploy countermeasures, or, the far more useful benefit, get chow for the others. Just in case the AbramsX autoloader systems do somehow break down, it's nice to have redundancy. On the subject of the autoloader, we know what you're probably thinking. What about all those Russian T-72s and T-80s in Ukraine whose autoloader turrets give NASA spaceships a run for their money? Don't they just get blown into orbit when they're hit by anti-tank missiles? Won't the AbramsX run into similar problems? It's a fair question. General Dynamics claims that it won't, keeping the Abrams' original ammo storage design, one that relies on a sealed ammunition compartment behind the main turret with blast doors that open only momentarily when loading around. It will avoid the pitfalls of the Russian autoloader variants, which stores their ammo cyclically underneath the turret. With its lighter footprint, the AbramsX draws more from its power plant by replacing the original Abrams turbine engine with a diesel hybrid electric system. Operating in parallel with an advanced Cummins diesel engine, the main power source, a high-powered electric generator provides up to 50% fuel savings over the long run, enabling crews to engage quiet mode on stationary operations without starting the main engine. These batteries also provide a helpful option for exporting power to adjacent units. Apart from these improvements where the AbramsX shines in its upgradability, the AbramsX is fully modular, making use of the Catalyst Next Generation Electronic Architecture (NGEA) that relies heavily on AI for target identification and acquisition, land navigation and path planning, and next-generation situational awareness. The three-man crew is surrounded by a digital interface that offers far more visibility than its predecessors. Their vision gets amplified as crews control adjacent UAVs, robotic ground vehicles, and switchblade drones from the comfort of their bucket seat recliners. The NGEA is fully upgradable as new systems are developed, giving AbramsX space to grow into new roles as battlefield technology evolves. The AbramsX boasts even more lethality than current Abrams models. Even though it retains its original 1200mm main gun, it replaces the traditional 50 caliber turret-mounted exterior machine gun with a fully remote 30mm chain gun. In effect, this transforms the Abrams' secondary weapon from an anti-personnel, human-fired machine gun into essentially an M1 Bradley in miniature, one capable of engaging soft and lightly armored targets using programmable airburst munitions. This, General Dynamics claim, will serve as a better response to anti-tank teams, while its trophy radar-guided active protective system (APS), basically a robotic shotgun, can shoot down incoming missiles and drones. This all sounds pretty amazing and cutting edge, right? However, while the AbramsX certainly improves many of the drawbacks associated with the M1A1 and A2 versions, it may not be as innovative as it seems. In 2015, the Russian armed forces revealed the T-14 Armata, a highly secretive next-generation main battle tank based on the Armata Universal Combat Platform. The Universal Armata design was originally intended to serve as a starting point for the next generation of Russian heavy infantry fighting vehicles, IFVs, and armored personnel carriers, AFVs. The T-14 tank iteration is capable in its own right. Coming in at a spry 55 tons, it is slightly bigger but also lighter than the M1 Abrams. Powered by a 1500 horsepower 12-speed automatic diesel engine, it's slightly faster than the Abrams. Costing $4 to $5 million per unit, it's also cheaper to produce, slightly more maneuverable, and claims to have an operational range of 310 miles. If anything, the T-14 may well prove to be a trendsetter. It was, after all, the world's first production tank with an unmanned turret, a design feature that AbramsX will replicate. It possesses a larger 125mm smoothbore cannon, an autoloader, reactive armor, and an active protective system (APS) similar to the one on the AbramsX. Like the AbramsX, the Armata's three-man crew store their rounds in a sealed turret compartment, separate from the cockpit. Likewise, the power plant autoloader and cockpits are sealed against nuclear, biological, and fire threats. The T-14 also has a merged engine transmission unit that can be swapped in 30 minutes in the field, and future variants may be equipped with a massive 152mm gun, which can fire guided missiles capable of shattering armor twice as thick as the Abrams. When it was first announced, the T-14 set the Western world into a frenzy. Could the existing M1A2 Abrams variants hold its weight against the latest Russian main battle tank? On paper at least, it was close. They had similar armament, top speeds, and armor. With its isolated crew compartment, the T-14 may have been able to better protect its operators. It had marginally better range, muzzle energy, fuel efficiency, and maintenance potential, but the robust 40-year-old Abrams design with its modern upgrades would almost certainly hold its own in a firefight, which did not bode well for Russia, since by the time they announced the T-14, there were already 10,000 operable Abrams produced and in use around the world. As it turned out, there wasn't much to worry about. Despite plans to acquire 2,300 T-14 tanks by 2025, there are still virtually no Armatas in use throughout the Russian armed forces. As the Armata program was beset by production issues, financial problems, and trial delays, its initial acquisition was scaled back to just 100 experimental vehicles, a number that Russia has fallen well short of reaching. Today, it's unknown just how many Armata tanks are either in production or being tested by the Russian armed forces, with some estimates claiming a mere 20 pre-production units were actually delivered. Can this tank actually be mass-produced, as the Abrams has been? The jury is still out. There are many other unknowns surrounding the project, whether it actually has participated in war games or live-fire events, whether the 50-ton tank could actually achieve the same level of survivability as the sturdier Abrams, or whether its autoloader system is as reliable as claimed. With the AbramsX incorporating and surpassing many of the design features introduced by the Armata, it would certainly be favored in a one-on-one duel. The fact that the existing Abrams is a time-tested, battle-proven main battle tank, a formidable base platform that will be continually improved upon and upgraded through 2050, is a huge mark in its favor. Already capable of matching up against the T-14 Armata, the fact remains that the price of upgrading existing and already manufactured M1A2s with the next generation technology is far cheaper than producing a new T-14, something Russia can't even dream of as the economic and military consequences of its ill-planned invasion of Ukraine mount. So, could the AbramsX destroy the Russian T-14 Armata? In the end, the accuracy of rangefinders, high-fidelity sensors, and computer targeting would most likely determine the outcome of this tank duel. As one commentator noted, small differences in lethality will likely matter less if one tank is able to see the other, while the other cannot detect at similar ranges. The tank that can find, target, and hit the other one from longer range is likely to prevail in any kind of war engagement. The true difference maker, however, in a fight between the AbramsX and the T-14 Armata would likely not be the tank's technology, armament, or munitions, but in the quality of the crew. This is where the AbramsX, or any modern Abrams model for that matter, would truly shine. Operated by competent, well-trained crews with effective NCOs, something the Russians no longer have, tanks are only as good as the humans inside of them. With a strong emphasis on combined and joint operations, American tank crews would almost certainly benefit from air superiority, better intelligence, and integration with remote assets, not to mention far greater interoperability with their global allies and partners. These all matter on the modern battlefield and will continue to matter in the future. Where these factors fail, discipline, cohesion, and training will take care of the rest. In a notable point-blank tank skirmish during the invasion of Iraq, American tank crews in M1 Abrams tanks destroyed 7 Iraqi T-72s at a distance of less than 50 yards, having never fired live ammunition in their training due to the economic sanctions in effect, something the Russian Mobics might relate to today. The Iraqis did not even register a single hit on their American counterparts. Yes, training, drill, and cohesion matter a great deal indeed. Until both next-generation tanks actually enter the production line, something that for Russia may not happen at all, as recent reports indicate it has halted its 20 trillion ruble program altogether, one-on-one showdowns between the AbramsX and the T-14 Armata will likely remain confined to our imagination. But if you had to pick one, who would you go with? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.
The M1 Abrams is the main battle tank of the United States Army. It's regarded as the most powerful tank in the world, even though its design is nearly 50 years old. But have you heard about Russia's latest tank? The much-touted T-14 may be the first tank in the world who can go head-to-head with the American Abrams and win. In fact, the T-14 has been heralded as an Abrams killer. Others have called it an Abrams assassin. It's a radical departure from the traditional tank design in many ways, especially the thought process that bigger is better. Not only that, Russia has said goodbye to a manned turret and instead protects its crews in a special armored compartment, sealed off from the rest of the tank. As we'll find out in this video, other unusual features on the T-14 might allow it to surpass the Abrams as the baddest tank in the world. Before we begin comparing the two tanks, let's look at the evolution of the Abrams and how it became the most dominant tank in the world. The M1 Abrams was designed by the United States in the early 1970s to replace the M60, which served as America's main battle tank throughout much of the Cold War. It was upgraded time and time again to try and keep pace with the Soviet Union, but that was not an easy task. In the 1960s and early 1970s, it seemed like the Russians were introducing a new tank every other day. First, the Soviets introduced the T-62 in 1961,
3 years later came the T-64, and in 1973, Russian tank technology took a huge leap forward with the T-72. With the introduction of the T-72, it was becoming increasingly clear that the American M60 was past its prime. Something needed to be done, and fast. The first attempt by the United States was the MBT-70, which was a joint effort between the United States and West Germany. It was to have a massive 152mm gun launcher that could fire both conventional ammunition and long-range Shillelagh-guided anti-tank missiles. It also had a 22mm autocannon mounted on the top of the turret and a 7.62 Coxal machine gun. The MBT-70 packed a wallop, but it was not to be. Design and other disagreements led West Germany to abandon the project in 1969, leading to the development of the Leopard 1. The United States continued development on its own for a while, but abandoned the MBT-70 project in 1971 due to cost overruns. The United States went back to the drawing board to come up with a new tank that would surpass Soviet designs. The new tank was the M1 Abrams. The M1 Abrams is named after Creighton Abrams, a former Army Chief of Staff and commander of the 37th Armored Battalion during World War II, where he served under General George S. Patton. Patton was incredibly impressed by Abrams. He was so highly regarded that Patton once said, "I'm supposed to be the best tank commander in the Army, but I have one peer, Abe Abrams. He's the world champion." Development of the M1 Abrams began in January 1971, when the US Army established a task force to develop a new main battle tank. The Pentagon began by laying out the requirements for the third generation of American tanks. It specified weight, width, and cost. The weight should not exceed 58 tons, the width could not be more than 12 feet, and finally, the tank should cost no more than roughly $510,000 per tank. The Pentagon selected 2 contractors to submit prototype designs, Chrysler Defense and General Motors. Both were given 3 years to submit their designs. So long as the 2 companies met the basic requirements, they were largely given the freedom to make trade-offs in areas such as mobility, survivability, and transportability. Both companies submitted their prototypes, each with different strengths and weaknesses. One of the key differences between the prototypes was the engine design. GM went with a more traditional diesel engine similar to the one used by the M60, but much more powerful. Chrysler's prototype used a modified helicopter turbine engine designed by Honeywell. Chrysler's decision to go with a modified aircraft engine to power a tank raised some eyebrows, as it had never been done before. But that did not stop Chrysler from pursuing a turbo-powered tank because it saw the advantages of using such an engine. It was smaller and lighter than a traditional diesel engine and produced very little visible exhaust. It was also quieter and easier to maintain because it had fewer parts. There were also obvious disadvantages to using a modified helicopter engine in a tank. There were no interchangeable parts with other tanks in the American arsenal, requiring the Army to maintain a special inventory just for the M1. Likewise, mechanics largely familiar with diesel engines would need to undergo highly specialized training to work on the engine. It guzzled fuel at an enormous rate. The engine also needed to pull in clean air for the engine to operate properly. Unpaved roads and open terrain create a tremendous amount of dust and dirt, so it needed to constantly scrub the incoming air to remove these kinds of particles. The US Army liked the General Motors prototype best and recommended going with that design. The Pentagon wasn't so sure. NATO was seeking to standardize as many components as possible among the tank models used by alliance members. As a result, the Pentagon asked both GM and Chrysler to modify their designs to support this initiative. Once the 2 prototypes were updated and tested, the United States went with the Chrysler proposal. Throughout its history, the Abrams has been repeatedly upgraded and enhanced to keep pace with technical advances. As a result, the United States has released 3 major variants: the M1, the M1A1, and the M1A2. A 4th variant was recently announced, the M1A3. To understand the differences between the 3 main variants of the M1, let's begin by talking about its initial design. The original M1 Abrams entered service in 1980. Coming in at 60 tons, the tank carried a 4-person crew. The commander sat in the right rear of the turret. The gunner and the loader were also in the turret, with the gunner in the front right and the loader in the left rear. The driver was located in the center of the front hull. Its main armament was the M68A1 105mm rifled gun. that could accurately kill enemy tanks at a range of 2,000 meters while on the move. It carried 55 shells in total and had a compartmentalized ammunition storage area with blowout panels that directed blasts away from the vehicle and the crew in the event of an ammunition explosion. The gun could fire at elevations between -10 to 20 degrees and was mounted on a 360-degree turret that could be turned manually or hydraulically. It had a laser rangefinder, a stabilizer, and a thermal imaging system. The digital ballistic computer automatically calculated firing solutions based on factors such as wind, range, and gun barrel droop. Other factors could also be entered manually into the computer to further improve accuracy. The entire system gave the Abrams a high first hit probability. The Abrams also carried a 50 caliber turret-mounted machine gun above the commander, a 7.62 machine gun located above the loader station, and a 7.62mm mounted coaxially with the main gun. Last but not least, the original Abrams had 2 externally mounted smoke grenade launchers to obscure American movements on the ground. It could also generate a cloud of heavy smoke from its engine compartment by injecting a small amount of diesel fuel into the exhaust. The 1,500 horsepower 6-speed transmission had a max road speed of 45 miles per hour. The engine was so quiet that the tank earned the nickname Whispering Death because of its ability to quietly sneak up on enemies. The engine was extremely powerful, and the first generation of Abrams could accelerate from 0 to 20 in 6.1 seconds. Although optimized for aviation fuel, it could also run using gasoline or diesel, giving it additional flexibility. The fuel tank held 500 gallons, giving the Abrams a range of 275 miles. For such a large tank, the Abrams traversed the battlefield very well. It had an excellent suspension with front and rear shock absorbers. It could cross trenches as wide as 9 feet and was capable of moving forward on terrain with as much as a 60% grade and a side slope of 40%. What really separated the Abrams from its Soviet counterparts was its revolutionary armor protection, which significantly increased crew survivability. Its core armor was a top-secret variation of British Cobham armor technology, a special arrangement of metal plates, ceramic blocks, and open space. The outer steel plate could be penetrated by both high-explosive and sabot rounds, but the ceramic material was able to absorb vast amounts of kinetic energy. It was also able to disperse metal shards and hot gases in the armor's open spaces. A second steel plate behind the ceramic material provided an additional level of protection. The front of the tank was sloped at an 82-degree angle to help deflect incoming rounds. A side skirt helped protect the tank's suspension, wheel sprockets, and tracks. The original M1 was quite the tank, and nearly 3,300 were produced between 1979 and 1985. It did not have much of an opportunity to show its capabilities on the battlefield. That would be reserved for the second generation of Abrams, the M1A1. Actually, when people talk about the M1 Abrams, they're usually referring to the M1A1. This is the tank that demolished huge numbers of Soviet-made Iraqi tanks and other armored vehicles, including those fielded by its vaunted Republican Guard, in a mere 100 hours during Operation Desert Storm. It's hard to begin describing the M1A1 except for saying, wow. It's slightly larger than its older brother, 63 tons versus 60 tons, but its lethality took a big leap forward. It also supported better armor protection and upgraded electronics. As with the original M1, the M1A1 uses the Honeywell AGT 1500 multi-fuel gas turbine. It can reach speeds of 45 miles per hour despite its increased armor weight, but has the same cruising range of 275 miles. One of the biggest differences between the two tanks is the main gun. Instead of the rifled 105mm cannon used on the original Abrams, the M1A1 supports a 120mm smoothbore cannon, allowing it to fire larger rounds at a higher muzzle velocity. Not only that, the M1A1 fires depleted uranium shells, giving it greater penetrating power. The 120mm cannon also increases its firing range from 2,000 meters to 2,500 on the move. This range increase is significant because the A1 could now fire at opposing tanks while remaining well out of their range. This proved invaluable during the First Gulf War. Another big difference came in the form of increased armor protection. While the armor on the original M1 was excellent, the M1A1's is even better. It also employs Cobham armor technology, but designers added another level of protection, a layer of depleted uranium mesh. Depleted uranium armor is non-radioactive and has a density of at least 2.5 times greater than steel. Although this layer of depleted uranium did not make the armor on the M1A1 impenetrable, it could take a much bigger punch and remain operational. Not only that, designers lined the interior of the M1A1 turret with Kevlar, further increasing the chances of crew survivability in the event of a hit. The layer of depleted uranium plus the Kevlar did add 3 tons of additional weight to the Abrams, but what's a mere 3 tons between friends? So how do we know that the M1A1 was so good? While the original M1 participated in war games, it was never tested in battle. That would not be the case for the M1A1. In August 1990, the country of Iraq invaded its Kuwaiti neighbor without much of a fight. Iraq was no pushover militarily. It had the 5th largest army in the world, with nearly 1 million personnel. Not only that, it had thousands of Soviet main battle tanks. Iraq's armor force was primarily comprised of outdated Soviet T-55 and T-62 tanks. However, its elite Republican Guard fielded approximately 1,000 T-72s. The United States had built a coalition of many nations, each contributing to a massive buildup of men and machines along the Saudi border with Kuwait and Iraq. For its part, the Americans had amassed nearly 500,000 troops and thousands of tanks, including nearly 2,000 Abrams M1A1s. There was no question that the M1A1 outmatched Iraq's T-55s and T-62, but how would it fare against the T-72? 2 key tank battles answered that question. In the Battle of 73 Easting, 9 M1A1s, supported by 12 Bradley fighting vehicles, took on an Iraqi tank force comprised of T-62s, 72s, and armored personnel carriers. In a matter of 23 minutes, the Iraqis lost 50 tanks and 25 armored personnel carriers. Only 1 M1A1 suffered any noticeable damage, and that was caused when it ran over a mine. The largest tank battle of the war took place the next day at the Battle of Medina Ridge. In this battle, the American 1st Armored Division took on 6 Iraqi divisions, mostly from the vaunted Iraqi Republican Guard. The United States attacked using nearly 350 Abrams M1A1s, combined with aviation assets, artillery, and Bradley fighting vehicles armed with anti-tank vehicles. The Iraqis fielded hundreds of tanks as well, mostly T-72s. It's difficult to assess exactly how many of the T-72s were destroyed by the M1A1s, given that the Americans also fielded infantry and air assets in this battle, but certain facts provide insight into what happened. When the fighting started, Abrams commanders quickly realized that they significantly outranged their Iraqi counterparts, avoiding the need to close in on the opposing T-72s. Abrams crews reported that the 120mm main gun was highly accurate, and they had no problems penetrating the armor of the T-72 it faced. As the battle was fought under poor weather conditions, Army observers attributed the gun's high degree of accuracy to superior sights and other intangible factors. Several Abrams crews also reported that the tank's secret armor composition fared extremely well, suffering only minimal damage when they received direct frontal hits from Iraqi T-72s. These reports were supported by Abrams losses, or lack thereof, during the fight. Despite the presence of hundreds of Iraqi tanks, only 14 Abrams were damaged and another 9 were destroyed. Of those 9, none of them came as a direct result of being hit by the 125mm main gun on the T-72. 7 were the result of friendly fire, and 2 were intentionally destroyed after becoming stuck in the muddy ground. The Abrams armor was so good that not a single crewman was lost in the battle. In comparison, the United States destroyed 186 Iraqi tanks, most of which were T-72s. That's 1.5 tanks per minute. The Americans also destroyed another 127 armored vehicles. The Abrams only faced 2 issues of significance during the war. First was the tank's high fuel consumption rate, due to the turbine engine. On its way to Baghdad, the United States had to make a strategic pause to allow supply vehicles to catch up with the tanks. The other issue was the need to frequently clean the air filters because of the sandy desert conditions. Tank crews did make some suggestions on ways to improve the Abrams, such as greater sight magnification and resolution, improved thermal viewers, and the need for a system to reduce friendly fire incidents. The United States built nearly 5,000 M1A1 Abrams tanks between 1985 and 1992. That year, it released the M1A2, the next generation of Abrams. The M1A2, which was later further upgraded to incorporate an enhanced systems package, is the most advanced Abrams to date. It's both very familiar and very different from the M1A1. In terms of similarities, the M1A2 retains the 1500 horsepower turbine engine used in the previous two models. It also retains the 120mm smoothbore main gun, the 50 caliber machine gun, and the two 7.62mm machine guns. Externally, the M1A2 retains much of the same look as the M1A1, but looks can be deceiving. The armor on the M1A2 has been significantly improved. In previous versions, only the front armor of the tank incorporated the depleted uranium mesh. In the new Abrams, the turret and side armor have been upgraded to incorporate depleted uranium to reduce the chance of penetration by rocket-propelled grenades and other man-portable rocket systems. Furthermore, the designers coated the mesh with a layer of graphite throughout the tank to strengthen the entire tank. The armor below the tank was also improved to reduce damage caused by mines and IEDs. Improved armor increased the weight of the tank to upwards of 70 tons, 10 tons more than the original M1. The added weight of the armor reduced the road speed to 42 miles per hour compared to 45 miles per hour in earlier versions of the M1. Where the M1A2 really shines is its upgraded electronics and its tremendous advances in technology. It is an all-digital tank with new displays that provide the commander and crew members with better understanding of the tank's operational status. The tank commander has been provided with an improved weapons station, an all-weather independent thermal viewer, and a position navigation system. With this positional navigation system, the Abrams M1A2 can identify its location relative to other friendly units. Drivers have been provided with an upgraded picture-in-picture digital display. In addition, the gunner's primary sight has been further stabilized to improve the already impressive accuracy of the Abrams smoothbore 120mm cannon. The tank's lethality has also improved through the addition of an ammunition data link that allows the tank to use multi-purpose rounds. This means that shells can be programmed to explode in different ways, such as on contact, in the air, or on delay. As the Abrams is now digital, improvements were also made to its internal power system. In past Abrams variants, the entire tank, including electronics, was powered by the turbine engine. If the engine was not running, simple actions such as moving the turret in a different position were not possible. To solve this challenge, designers added a compact auxiliary power system. Capable of generating 10 kilowatts of electricity, this single-cylinder diesel engine produces enough power to keep the tank's electronic systems operational without the main engine running. It's also very fuel efficient and can operate on most types of diesel. Another innovation is the M1A2's ability to automatically reroute electric power to various components in the event of damage to a conduit. Designers made this possible by incorporating a multiple bus system that automatically redistributes electricity to a component by using an alternative path. The M1A2's communication capabilities have also been improved through the addition of a joint tactical radio system. This system allows for the integration of handheld, manpack, and small form-fit dual-channel radios that allow communication between soldiers on the ground, mounted platforms, and headquarters. In terms of electronic self-protection countermeasures, designers added an ANVLQ-12 Crew Duke Counter IED system. This system can electronically block enemy radio transmissions used to detonate roadside bombs, protecting the tank from improvised explosive devices. While the Abrams M1A2 is currently recognized as the top tank in the world, the Russian T-14 Armata is no slouch. Although beset with technical and production challenges, it puts Russia's T-72, T-80, and T-90 to shame. Let's take a look at it. The T-14 is Russia's future main battle tank. It's based on the Armata Universal Combat Platform, which is a modular tracked vehicle that can be modified to create several different types of vehicles. Not only can it be used to construct T-14 and other tank models, but it can also be converted into infantry fighting vehicles, tank support combat vehicles, self-propelled artillery, combat engineering vehicles, and armored recovery vehicles. There are also plans to create a mobile air defense system from the base platform. Russia intends to use the Armata Universal Combat Vehicle to replace its current fleet of T-72 tanks and its BMPs. Designed by the Russian defense company Uralvagonzavod, from 2013 to 14, the T-14 made its first public appearance at the Moscow Victory Day Parade in 2015. State trials began in early 2020, and the tank may have briefly taken the battlefield against Ukraine in April 2023 to test it in real combat conditions, though that has not been independently confirmed.
In terms of specifications, the T-14 is powered by a 12-cylinder 1500 horsepower diesel engine with a road speed measured between 50 and 55 miles per hour. It has an 8-speed automatic transmission, 7 forward and 1 reverse. It has a range of approximately 310 miles. Its impressive range and speed are likely due to its lighter weight at 55 tons. The Armata can handle gradients as high as 60% and side slopes of 40. It can also cross trenches as wide as 9 feet. The Armata carries a crew of 3, all located in an armored compartment at the front of the tank. The driver is positioned on the left side of the forward compartment. The gunner sits directly in the middle and the commander on the right. Each crew member has an individual hatch to enter and exit the vehicle. If all of the crew members are in the front of the tank, who's in the turret? Who loads the shells? Well, the answer is no one. As with the design of the T-72, T-80 and T-90, the Armata uses an autoloader, allowing for a smaller crew than tanks like the Abrams. It carries 45 rounds, with 32 shells in the autoloader. The T-14 was not the first tank to incorporate an unmanned turret, but most designs that incorporated this feature never moved beyond the prototype stage. The use of an unmanned turret significantly improves crew survivability, even when the tank is fully penetrated by an enemy round. Another benefit of an unmanned turret is that no space is needed to house the crew members. This allowed the designers to reduce the silhouette of the Armata, making it harder to spot, both on the battlefield and under concealment. In terms of armor protection, the base armor on the Armata is comprised of steel, ceramics, and other materials similar to the Abrams Cobham armor. On top of the base armor, the Armata also has Malachite add-on explosive reactive armor to the front of the tank for further protection. Designers added slat armor to the back of the tank to make it less susceptible to rocket-propelled grenades. In terms of passive protection capabilities, the Armata uses radar-absorbent materials to make it more difficult for ground search radars to detect the tank. It's been said, but not confirmed, that the Armata is also using materials on the tank's underbelly that are less likely to set off magnetic mine fuses. The Armata also employs the Afghanet protection system to destroy incoming missiles and rockets at distances of up to 50 meters. The Afghanet system has sensors that detect incoming threats and a specialized computer to determine the likely impact point. Once that's been calculated, the Armata automatically tries to disrupt the projectile's guidance system by electronic means and fires a blast of metal shards, much like a shotgun, in the air to destroy missiles kinetically, all within seconds. The T-14 Armata is armed with a 125mm smoothbore cannon with an estimated range of 5 kilometers. Not only can it fire several different types of shells, including heat, sabot, and airburst cluster munitions, it can also launch long-distance laser-guided missiles at tanks and low-flying helicopters at a range of 12 kilometers. Its secondary weapons include a 7.62 machine gun and a 12.7mm heavy machine gun, which is equivalent to the American 50 cal machine gun. There have also been some sightings of T-14s carrying a 57mm automatic grenade launcher instead of the 12.7mm machine gun. As all of these weapons are mounted on the turret, they are operated remotely. The advantage of this approach is that crew members do not need to expose themselves to potential harm to fire the T-14's secondary weapons. Now that we understand the capabilities of the Abrams and the Armata, which one is the superior tank on a modern battlefield? To make a fair comparison, we need to level the playing field. Factors such as production numbers, technical and manufacturing challenges, previous combat performance, and crew training will not be considered. We will, however, compare these tanks on how they would perform in modern warfare, using the conflict in Ukraine as the basis, starting with maneuverability. Today's battlefield is reminiscent of the First World War, with its extensive trench networks and the widespread use of artillery. Progress is measured in meters, not miles. Extensive use of tank obstacles, such as Dragon's Teeth, prevent tanks from moving swiftly across the battlefield. Neither the Abrams nor the Armata have sufficient ground clearance to run over a 4-foot obstacle. The Abrams has a ground clearance of 19 inches. The precise ground clearance on the Armata is not known, but with certainty, the Armata cannot roll over a 4-foot obstacle. The use of anti-tank ditches is widespread in the Ukraine war. Both the Abrams and the Armata can cross trenches up to 9 feet. Unfortunately for both tanks, anti-tank ditches in Ukraine can be up to 19 feet wide,
and 13 feet deep. Neither tank can overcome ditches of such a size. Maneuverability is more than just how well a tank can move across a battlefield. It also includes the ability of tanks to reach the battlefield itself. Again and again, we have seen rows of destroyed Russian tank columns along Ukrainian roadways long before they reach where the actual fighting is taking place. The T-14 Armata is significantly faster than the Abrams, with a road speed of at least 50 miles per hour or more. In comparison, the heavily armored Abrams lumbers along at 42 miles per hour. But does that really matter? Probably not. The Ukrainians utilized drones and other precise weaponry to destroy the first and last tanks in a column formation, typically from above. The other tanks in the column must try and maneuver around the destroyed tanks, which they cannot do quickly. This gives the Ukrainians time to deploy artillery to destroy the other tanks in the column. Yes, this is a question of tactics, but the fact is that the Russians continue using tank columns despite experiencing heavy losses throughout the war. There's no indication that Russia will change its approach, and the T-14 is likely to travel in columns as well. Taking this into consideration, the Armata's speed does not give it any advantage over the Abrams. So far, neither the Abrams nor the Armata have any advantages over the other in the category of maneuverability. There is, however, a significant difference in operational range. The Armata can travel 310 miles without refueling. The Abrams M1A2, with its gas-guzzling turbine engine, only has a range of 265 miles. Although the superiority of American logistics probably could mitigate the difference, based on a tank versus tank comparison, the Armata clearly outranges the Abrams. Although both tanks are very similar when it comes to maneuverability, the Armata has an important advantage over the Abrams because it can travel longer distances between fill-ups. Winner, T-14 Armata. Now let's talk about armament. The M1A2 Abrams has a 120mm smoothbore cannon, with an effective range between 3,000 to 4,000 meters. In comparison, the Armata has a 125mm smoothbore with a range of 5,000 meters. In terms of punching power, both tanks are similar, with any difference coming as a result of the effectiveness of the round's design. In terms of effective weapon range, the Armata has a huge advantage over the Abrams, and that doesn't even consider the Armata's ability to fire laser-guided missiles at even greater distances. So the Armata is far superior than the Abrams in this category, right? Well, not so fast. Remember, we are comparing these tanks on a modern battlefield, not on a gun range. Except for open terrain such as a desert, the ability of either tank to fire at its maximum range is unlikely. There are a variety of obstacles that visually obscure targets, such as wooded areas and well-developed fortifications, making it difficult for tanks to face off against each other at their maximum firing range. So distance is not a great way to measure the effectiveness of either gun. What matters more is accuracy, which is determined by the technology used in the tank. Both tanks employ the same basic visual aiming methods, such as rangefinders and thermal viewers. The big difference is the technology used in fire control systems, visual sights, and gun stabilizers. The tank with the most advanced technology has a clear advantage over its opponent. Given the secrecy around the Armata's technological capabilities, we cannot determine whether the T-14 is superior to the Abrams in this category. We must look at it differently. The United States is a global leader in developing and improving military technology. It would be difficult to find another country that can keep pace with American military technology. While we do not have any hard data that supports our conclusions, we feel confident that the Abrams can fire rounds with greater accuracy than the Armata. Winner, M1A2 Abrams. But how does it fare when it comes to armor and protection? This is a difficult category to assess. Armor on the Abrams and Armata follow the same basic design principles of combining steel, ceramics, and other materials to protect against kinetic and explosive attacks. Both the United States and Russia are highly secretive about their armor technology, and it's impossible to tell which one might be better. Armor thickness is not a good way to assess effectiveness anymore. It might have been when everyone used steel, but that's no longer the case. We can assume that the frontal armor of both tanks is more effective than their turret or side armor. It's also fair to say that the weakest point on both tanks is the top armor. The use of reactive armor on the Armata does not play a role in comparing the two tanks. The Abrams has the same capability, though generally not used. Where the Armata does stand out is its ability to automatically deploy countermeasures to thwart incoming rockets and propelled grenades. This has caught the eye of American military leaders who are currently assessing if a similar feature should be incorporated into the Abrams. What about the unmanned turret? Does that give the Armata an advantage? Not at all. The unmanned turret certainly increases crew survivability, but does not improve the level of overall tank protection. If anything, it actually may decrease the ability of the T-14 to survive on the battlefield. It's widely believed that armor on the Armata's turret has been kept to a minimum to save weight. Some claim it's only strong enough to stop autocannon fire. Others believe that with its low turret silhouette, it's difficult to hit the turret from either side. Neither matter. The real threat to tanks in modern warfare are weapons that can strike from above, such as attack drones and man-portable missiles, such as the Javelin. Why is that important? It's important because the T-14 Armata uses an autoloader for its main gun. As we've seen in Ukraine, it's not uncommon for Russian tank turrets to explode when hit, often flying off the tank completely in a catastrophic explosion. This is due to the lack of adequate protection for the shells stored in the turret. By minimizing turret armor to reduce the weight of the tank, it's likely the Armata will suffer a similar fate. Although the ability of the T-14 to deploy countermeasures against incoming missiles is interesting, we believe that the lack of adequate turret armor is a proven liability. Winner, M1A2 Abrams. Whether or not the T-14 Armata is an Abrams killer is not important. As the war in Ukraine has shown, tanks are not as important as they once were. They have largely become long-range infantry support vehicles that allow ground troops to move forward under the cover of their fire. The days of tank breakthroughs are over. It's simply too dangerous for tanks to close in on enemy positions, and that doesn't even take into account the many anti-tank obstacles that severely limit battlefield mobility. The United States is currently in the process of transferring 31 M1A1s to Ukraine. They have been promoted as a game changer, that they will crush enemy units on the battlefield, allowing a much-needed breakthrough. Although it's possible, it is unlikely. They too will likely become infantry support vehicles. Shouldn't the M1A1's much-touted armor provide the Abrams with sufficient protection on the battlefield? Not exactly. Ukraine is receiving the export version of the M1A1, which is purposely downgraded so that it's not the equivalent to the Abrams fielded by the US Army. Armor on the export version of the M1A1 does not include the depleted uranium mesh, making it significantly weaker than the American version. Only time will tell. What do you think? Will the Abrams make a difference in the war in Ukraine, or will it become just another infantry support vehicle on the battlefield? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. On the one hand, we've got Putin, who's managed to maintain his iron control over the population through propaganda and repression, all the while claiming that victory is imminent. He threatens the West with both nuclear and conventional attacks, and continues to sacrifice enormous amounts of soldiers and materiel. All the while, Russia's position is deteriorating under the effects of crushing economic sanctions, shrinking war supplies, lack of qualified recruits, and rebellious military contractors. Ukraine is in a slightly better position, as President Volodymyr Zelensky has kept national spirits high, and the country continues to receive huge amounts of advanced military supplies from NATO, the US, and other allies. Even so, Russia continues to occupy large parts of eastern Ukraine, and the ongoing Ukrainian counteroffensive has made slow progress in retaking the heavily fortified Russian positions. The progress of Ukraine's armed forces, the AFU, largely depends on continued Western military support and high national morale. But with critical elections in many Western countries coming soon, many people have begun to ask how and when the war will come to an end. Hein Germans, a military historian, expert in territorial conflicts, and University of Rochester professor, recently sat down to discuss the topic on CNN. His interview covered several possible scenarios for the end of the war, and how likely each might be, and just what would be needed for them to actually happen. In this video, we'll go over some of his arguments and dive into what they mean for the coming year. Probably the most important takeaway from German's work is that we shouldn't expect things to wind down anytime soon. He has studied conflicts for decades and concluded that in many cases, wars don't end decisively. World Wars I and II are among the rare instances of major conflicts ending with total victories and the unconditional surrender of the defeated. The US Civil War is another prominent example, although in that case the losing side was not even a fully formed country. However, in most conflicts, both warring parties will do anything necessary to avoid a complete loss. This generally means that they change tactics, make some sort of temporary retreat, or continue fighting at a lower level of intensity to try and wear down their opponents. But for the sake of argument, let's first take a look at what a total victory would actually entail for both sides in the Russo-Ukrainian war. A total Russian victory, which now seems incredibly unlikely, was pretty much the standard assumption when the conflict began in 2022. During the first days of Russia's invasion, it was definitely a real possibility. Troops surged across the border, tanks rolled towards Kyiv, and airstrikes rained down across the country. Putin hoped to quickly encircle and take control of the capital, capture, kill, or drive Zelensky into exile, and set up a puppet government before the West could take actions against him. This nearly worked too. A huge initial advance of Russian troops from Belarus took over Kyiv suburbs and pushed forward towards the city center. But thanks to remarkably clever tactics and pure grit, Ukraine was able to stop the offensive and deny Russian troops access to key points. While the war has since turned into a grinding stalemate of trench warfare, Russia did manage to pull off several surges which at times overwhelmed Ukrainian defenders and could have threatened vital positions. The areas Russia has managed to keep occupying, like the towns of Bakhmut and Soledar, have come at a huge cost. Most are now bombed-out shells, empty of people, and with little real strategic value to either side. Due to the cost of taking these areas, Russia also does not have the military or economic capabilities to actually overrun other parts of Ukraine. As a result, the total Russian victory that Putin has been promising is likely impossible without some major changes to conditions on the ground. But any path he could take to make these happen would also have some serious problems and consequences. For instance, take Putin's threats of resorting to the nuclear option if the West does not cut off its support for Ukraine. The idea has likely been to force their capitulation by presenting himself as willing to impose such high costs that support for Ukraine is no longer worthwhile. But, at least so far, this just hasn't worked. For one thing, no military planners or experts seriously believe that Putin or his generals are truly insane enough to launch a full nuclear strike on NATO targets, a move that would likely result in mutually assured destruction. This leaves the possibility of a limited or tactical nuclear strike on a target inside Ukraine. But while such an attack would no doubt be incredibly deadly, there is little reason to think that it would force Ukraine or its allies to surrender. Instead, a tactical nuke would probably harden Ukrainian resolve even further and cause the West to send its most powerful weapons to the front. It's also unclear how many of Russia's nuclear weapons are actually still effective. Most are Cold War relics which have been sitting in storage for decades with questionable maintenance. The other glaring issue with using a nuclear strike to force Ukrainian surrender is that detonating even a small nuclear device in Ukraine would risk nuclear fallout blowing back into Russia. The last thing Putin wants is to irradiate his own territory, making this a truly impractical option for actually ending the war. But Germans also emphasizes that Putin does have some other options up his sleeve, even if most of them are long shots. One of these revolves around international support, which has been a serious issue for Russia from the beginning. Most of the world has either committed to supporting Ukraine in some fashion or made an effort to stay out of the conflict entirely. While some national leaders like Brazilian President Lula da Silva have blamed both sides and called for an end to the fighting, very few governments have actually given Russia any real support. Those that have are mostly either Russian puppet governments like Belarus or rogue states such as Iran and North Korea who also oppose the West. These two countries have been supplying Russia with most of its outside weaponry, such as the Iranian Shahed kamikaze drones, which have been repeatedly used to attack Ukrainian cities and infrastructure. Arms deals like that are the only way for Russia to actually evade sanctions and export bans, but the equipment they provide are not nearly enough to ensure a real victory. This leaves one looming possibility which the West would really like to avoid: China lending its support to Russia's war effort. China's role in the conflict has already proven to be somewhat unique, as Chinese President Xi Jinping has had no issue posing for photos with Putin, who he has called his best and most intimate friend. Since the introduction of sanctions last year, China has become by far Russia's most important economic supporter, with trade between the two reaching an all-time high of $190 billion in 2022. The same year, Russian imports from China increased 13% to $76 billion, and its exports to China increased by 43% to $114 billion. A large part of this is the sale of oil and gas, which have long been Russia's most important economic asset. Some analysts have also argued that China wants Putin to set off an age of conquest, which would form the ideal political backdrop for an invasion of Taiwan. If China did lend its complete support to Putin, there is the possibility that it would make the West nervous enough to push Ukraine's government into some sort of lopsided peace negotiations. However, in many ways, China's support for the invasion is still only superficial. It has not supplied Russia with any lethal weapons, and its government has been vocal that this is not about to change. This is especially true after the 24-hour mutiny of the Russian paramilitary Wagner Group and its chief Yevgeny Prigozhin last month, who is now hiding out in Belarus. The defection seems to have made Xi increasingly nervous about supporting a weakened, unpredictable nuclear state on China's border. As Ryan Hass, a top advisor to Barack Obama on China policy, recently wrote in the New York Times, Mr. Xi cannot afford to abandon Mr. Putin altogether. He has invested too much in the relationship, and Russia remains useful to China. But the bromance that has caused so much concern in the West has probably peaked. If Mr. Xi is to achieve his strategic goal of surpassing US strength around the world, he will need to rebalance his foreign policy to account for Mr. Putin's vulnerabilities. That may mean stronger Chinese support for ending a war that has backfired so severely on the Russian leader, and a potentially less confrontational Chinese approach toward the United States and Taiwan. Germans makes a similar point. Basically, as Xi and his government have become aware that fully supporting Putin will undermine their own geopolitical agenda, the chances of Chinese involvement to end the war have plummeted. This leaves Putin with pretty limited options for securing a total victory. One possibility is relying on support from two Eastern European countries where Russia still holds some influence. The first of these is Belarus, where Russian troops could potentially mass and attempt another invasion of Kyiv from the north. However, seeing as this strategy already failed back when Russia hadn't lost nearly 50,000 soldiers and half of all its functioning battle tanks, a similar attack now would probably go even worse, since Ukraine is now armed to the teeth with advanced Western weapon systems and training. The other possibility is the involvement of Moldova, Ukraine's small southwestern neighbor. While Moldova's government is not supportive of Putin or his war, Russia has spent years sponsoring a separatist movement in the east of Moldova on the Ukrainian border. This small region, known as Transnistria, holds a battalion of Russian troops who has so far stayed out of the conflict in Ukraine. But that could change quickly, as Transnistria could easily become another staging ground for Russian troops to launch an offensive in the south. If coordinated with an attack from Belarus, such a pincer movement could prove to be a serious issue for Kyiv, forcing them to defend from two directions. But again, the odds of this strategy leading to a complete Russian victory are pretty slim. If attempted without Chinese weaponry, such an attack would have to take Ukrainian and Western war planners completely by surprise. Considering how effective intelligence has been at detecting Russian troop movements, there is little chance that this would be possible. The attack would also likely have to utilize some elements of asymmetric warfare, like mounting an effective rural insurgency or assassinating key elements in the Ukrainian command structure. Again, this seems like a very remote possibility. Finally, it would require credible threats of mass destruction from Putin in order to deter a counterstrike, something he hasn't been able to pull off so far. All things considered, there is now only a tiny chance that Russia could achieve a total victory in Ukraine, quite the change from a year and a half ago. So, what are the alternatives? Well, one slightly less distant possibility is that of a Ukrainian victory. While experts and analysts completely dismiss the chance of Ukraine actually winning the war back when it started, after a few weeks, many began to change their minds. As the tide of battle turned and Russian troops were pushed out of Kyiv and forced back into the east, it became clear that Ukrainians stood a chance of coming out on top. This still seems to be the case, although the path to total victory remains very tough. Considering just how badly Russia has fared on the battlefield, as well as its diminishing war supplies, internal defections, and weak economy, it seems logical that Putin cannot continue forever. Ukraine has become increasingly bold as well, vowing to retake every inch of its territory, and even launching drone attacks on Moscow itself. Still, there are several clear obstacles to a Ukrainian victory. First, while Kyiv has gotten enormous amounts of powerful military aid from the West, Most of it is ground-based and generally geared towards defensive warfare. NATO countries have so far been quite hesitant about supplying Zelensky with long-range or aerial systems most useful for offense. There remain serious worries about these weapons being used to strike targets inside Russia, and thus escalate the conflict further. This does look to be changing some, as it was recently agreed that Ukraine will receive F-16 fighter jets and the training necessary to fly them. Even so, it's unclear whether the jets will actually allow Ukraine to retake occupied territory, as both sides are a long way from maintaining air superiority. Another big issue could be retaking Crimea. In recent months, Ukraine has become increasingly bold about its intentions to target and eventually retake the peninsula. This has come along with strikes on key arms depots and supply routes, signaling that a Ukrainian push to retake Crimea could come before too long. But actually doing this might be quite the challenge. Despite acknowledging that Crimea is Ukrainian, Western governments have been somewhat hesitant to fully back efforts to retake it, fearing that it could be a red line for Putin. Another issue is Russian fortifications. Recently, satellite imagery of Crimea shows a complex web of trenches, mines, and dragon's teeth set up around Medvedivka, a small town near the border of mainland Ukraine. The most likely strategy for Ukrainian forces would be to try and break through the land corridor between Crimea and the mainland, heading from Zaporizhia towards Melitopol and the Azov Sea. Doing so could split the Russian forces in two, while cutting off major supply routes into Crimea. Unfortunately, to do so, Ukrainian armor and ground units will have to get through the minefields, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, and numerous other hazards, while also taking heavy fire from Russian artillery and drones. All of this means that a lightning offensive to retake the area will be difficult and very bloody. Ukrainian commanders know this, and are likely trying to bide their time until more cracks in the Russian defenses begin to show. That brings us to the most likely possibility for how the war in Ukraine ends. That it doesn't, at least not anytime soon. There is a good chance that the conflict becomes a lower intensity, simmering conflict, with both sides trying to outlast the other. This type of war of attrition is quite common, especially when neither side has a clear path to victory. It also seems likely that Kyiv could bank on such a conflict going their way. Since Russia's international support is probably not increasing much, Ukraine may try to take back towns and cities where it can, forcing Russian troops to fight bitterly for every inch of territory, while whittling away at its troops and supplies a little more every week. With no real way to replace them, such a scenario definitely doesn't favor Russia. At some point, Ukraine may decide that Russian positions have been weakened enough to mount a final offensive on Crimea, or it may act more slowly, maintaining constant pressure and constricting supply lines until things become unsustainable. Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov recently stated that he believed Ukraine can retake its territory by the middle of 2024, but it remains to be seen whether that is actually possible. The scary thing with a war of attrition is that as things get more and more dire, Putin may become desperate enough to do something truly stupid. Even if Ukraine is able to slowly retake all of its territory, Putin still has enough missiles to conceivably keep bombarding the country from across the border. If this is the case, then the only thing that can really stop Putin is him ending up in prison or 6 feet under, otherwise known as a Russian retirement plan. Unfortunately, even if Putin is removed, there is no guarantee that his successor will be better. Some officials in Russia have been even more vocally pro-war than the man himself, and if they took over, it seems unlikely things would just end. But let's say that Putin or his successor finally sees the light and agrees to enter into negotiations with Kyiv. Some people would think that this would magically turn into a lasting peace, but the truth of the matter is that that is far from certain. According to data from the US Institute for Peace, up to 50% of peace agreements between warring parties break down within 5 years. Even when both sides know that continuing the war will be incredibly costly, there is a strong incentive to avoid giving concessions to the enemy or show weakness, especially in a brutal winner-takes-all political system such as Russia's. This spoiling effect means that it is difficult to make peace last without an absolute victory for one side, and suggests that negotiations between Ukraine and Russia wouldn't last very long, even if they managed to agree on terms. Successful peace deals are also very hard to carry out logistically, often involving partition, power sharing, autonomous zones, and other mechanisms which can easily devolve into more violence. In any negotiations, Putin and his supporters would almost certainly demand that some or all of eastern Ukraine remain under Russian control, or at least be politically independent from Kyiv. Considering that Putin still claims all of Russian-speaking Ukraine as his own, that the country's Jewish president is a Nazi, and that Ukraine was never really independent in the first place, the chance of negotiations producing results is not very good. So to sum things up, from the perspective of Germans and many other experts, the most likely way for the war in Ukraine to end is to not really end. Fighting will probably continue for quite a long time, but at a lower intensity of violence than during the first year or two of the war. Trenches and minefields will probably remain in place, and missiles will continue to needlessly kill Ukrainians who just want to live normal lives. And that's one of the biggest tragedies with wars. They are much easier to start than to stop. When Putin let the genie out of the bottle in 2014 and then again in 2022, he created a situation where violence may continue for years to come. Like so many other places, eastern Ukraine will remain a perpetual conflict zone, where nobody is really safe, and things can never truly go back to the way they were. While such a messy ending is far from ideal, as Germans makes clear, it is the most realistic outcome on the horizon. But what do you think? Will the war end in a real victory for one side? Or will this be another example of a simmering conflict with no real end? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more military content and analysis.